wolf was not breathing. Nora Ashfield knew it the way she knew everything that mattered in her work, not from a single piece of evidence she could point to, but from the accumulated weight of many small observations arriving at once, in a moment of clarity she could not reverse. She had spent enough years in sick rooms to know the difference between the sounds a body made in rest and the sound of no sound at all. The elder room at the end of the east wing corridor was too quiet. It had been too quiet for a long time, and this evening, as she stepped through the door with her canvas bag on one shoulder and her lantern lit against the November dark, she stopped in the threshold and let the knowledge arrive fully, without the protective softening she had been applying to it for weeks. She stood there for 10 seconds, not from fear, not from indecision. She stood because standing was what a person needed to do when something true arrived, and you had been keeping it at arm's length, and then suddenly, you could not anymore. Then she came inside, closed the door behind her, crossed to the spare bed nearest the window, took 2 heavy wool blankets from the folded stack, and carried them to the wide cedar platform where Greystone lay. She draped them over him with care, tucked the edges down along his sides, adjusted the corner nearest the window where the cold came through the gap between old stone and old frame. Her hands moved without needing her to direct them. That was what years of healing work did to a person's hands, taught them the shape of tending so thoroughly that the hands carried the knowledge even when the mind was somewhere else. Greystone lay as he always lay. His great head rested on his front paws, his legs stretched long before him on the cedar platform. His silver fur was long and very fine, the kind of fur that had once been magnificent and had aged into something quieter but perhaps more beautiful, deeper in color where it was thickest, silver white at the tips, catching the lantern light in ways that suggested illumination from within, rather than from without. His amber eyes were open, fixed on a point above the far wall that was not the ceiling, and not the window, and not any visible thing in the room. They had always been open, every evening she had come here. They had never once shifted in response to the sound of the door opening, or the sound of her voice, or the change in the room's light when she adjusted the lanterns. They held their fixed, distant gaze, with the absolute consistency of something that was no longer choosing to look at anything. She settled into the corner chair. The chair was old and wide, and had a cushion on it that she had brought from the storage room on her 3rd visit, when she had understood that she was going to be sitting in it regularly, and comfort was a reasonable request to make of a room you intended to inhabit. She tucked her feet up under her, reached into the canvas bag, and pulled out the field guide to mountain birds she had been reading that week. She opened it to the bookmarked page, where a sprig of dried lavender marked her place in the chapter on the alpine chough. She looked at Greystone for a moment before she began, the way she always did, that small, deliberate pause, her version of a greeting, or perhaps her version of an acknowledgement, that she was here, that she saw him, that the room was not empty even if the silence was deep. Then, she cleared her throat and let her voice settle into the register she used only in this room. Not loud, not soft, steady, and unhurried. The particular voice she had when no one needed anything from her, and she was not performing anything at all. It was, she had come to understand over 5 months, the most herself she sounded. She was 24 years old. She had been inside the Iron Crest Pack's territory for 18 of those years, which meant she had no real memory of anything that came before. Her parents, William and Grace Ashfield, had died on the East Road when she was 6 years old, in a rogue attack that she did not fully remember, and had stopped trying to fully remember sometime around the age of 15, when she understood that the trying did not produce the memory, and only produced a particular kind of ache. What she had instead were fragments that were either genuine memories or things she had assembled from the few words people had let slip over the years: sawdust and river water, the smell of her father's work clothes, a blue kitchen wall, very vivid, her mother's voice saying her name with a quality she could not have described but had never forgotten, a quality like a hand placed gently on the back of your neck when you were frightened. These fragments did not add up to parents she could remember. They added up to proof that she had been someone's child. She had decided, at some point, that this was enough. She had made a lot of those decisions over the years, decisions about what was enough, what was sufficient, what she could carry forward on, instead of what she wished she had. She was good at those decisions. They had kept her functional and useful, and most days, something close to content. Iron Crest pack wolves had found her in the root hollow of an oak tree the morning after the attack. She had been pressing herself into the roots with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who had been told very clearly to stay still, and had done exactly that, all night, through every sound and silence the dark had offered. A scout had heard her breathing before seeing her, and had reached in and lifted her out carefully, and she had not fought, which the scout had mentioned to others afterward, as something that had struck him. Not the stillness of shock, but a kind of deliberate cooperation, even then. She had looked at the wolf who was holding her, and she had said, very quietly, "Are they gone?" And when he had said yes, she had pressed her face against his shoulder and stayed there, and he had carried her all the way to the manor gate without putting her down. She had been given a room, food, education, and the particular form of tolerance that communities extended to those they were responsible for, without having chosen the responsibility. She had been treated fairly, which was different from being treated warmly, but she had learned early enough that the difference between fair and warm was a matter of survival or not, and fair was what survival required. The pack had not been cruel. They had simply been a pack, which meant their bonds ran deep in directions she could not follow, and she was present at the edges of something she would never be inside. By the time she was 12, and Lena had taken her into the healing rooms, with the pragmatic energy of someone who had identified a useful resource, and was going to make something of it, Nora had accepted the edges of her life, with something that was not quite resignation, and not quite peace, but that functioned like both. She had work, she was good at it. She had Lena, who treated her as a professional, and expected the same in return, which was its own form of respect. She had the library, and the long corridors, and the pine trees visible from the East Hall windows. She had enough. The evenings had always been the harder part. When work was done and the common rooms filled with the easy, deep, animal warmth of people who were bonded to each other in ways that went all the way down, she felt the shape of what she was in this place, the way you felt a missing step in the dark, suddenly and completely. She did not resent the pack for this. She had long since stopped using the energy that resentment required. She simply found, most evenings, that she was more comfortable in her room than in the common spaces, and she had arranged her evenings around that truth for years. And then, 5 months ago, she had found a better room. She had been looking for dried elderflower. Lena had said there was a supply somewhere in the east corridor, and Nora had been tasked with locating it before morning rounds. She had worked through 4 storage rooms, lifting her lantern into corners, and reading the handwritten labels on the old ceramic canisters. She had tried the 5th door without expecting anything particular, pushed it open, and the lantern light had reached the cedar bed in the far corner of the large, low-ceilinged room, and the great silver wolf lying on it had been illuminated in gold and shadow, and Nora had gone completely still. She could not have named afterward what it was about the room that stopped her. It was not the wolf alone, though the wolf was extraordinary. It was something about the space itself, the particular way the silence sat in it, neither heavy nor empty but present, like a third occupant. The cedar smell was rich and dry. The sage that had been hung from the rafters long ago and never taken down was a ghost of itself, barely there but unmistakable. The lantern light on the stone walls moved in a slow, gentle way that suggested the room was breathing, even if nothing inside it was. She had stood there for 2 full minutes, which was a very long time to stand in a doorway, and then she had found her elderflower in the storage chest along the far wall and carried it back to Lena and gone on with her evening. She had come back the next night with nothing but her own presence and a vague sense that the room had been expecting her, which was a thought she would have dismissed as fanciful in any other context, but which felt simply accurate in this one. On the 3rd night she had brought the folk story collection she had been reading before bed, tucked it under her arm before she left her quarters, and settled into the corner chair and opened it and begun to read aloud. Her voice in the room had surprised her with its quality, easier than her voice anywhere else, less managed, less careful about what it revealed. The room seemed to invite that. It asked nothing of her except presence. The folk stories had become botanical guides, which had become travel accounts, which had become almanacs, which had become a detailed history of the northern river systems, which had become the naturalist letters of Henry Marsh, which were currently becoming the Mountain Bird Field Guide. She had read Greystone approximately 35 books in 5 months. She kept a small stack of finished ones in the corner, and the current one, always on the chair arm. She had started keeping a flask of water in the room, and a tin of the mint candies she liked, and 2 cups. The second cup she had added 3 weeks ago without registering, when she had decided to add it, or why. Today had been difficult in the way days could be difficult, without any single thing breaking. She had risen before dawn to treat Cole, one of the younger warriors, for 2 cracked ribs from a training fall. He was 17, and bright, and irritatingly convinced that his body was made of something more resilient than bone, and she had spent 40 minutes strapping him firmly and explaining in plain terms that ribs healed at the pace ribs healed, and not 1 day faster, and he had argued this with the focused energy of someone whose pride was the only part of him that wasn't hurting. She had sent him to rest. She had known before he left the room that he would attempt to be back in training by day 3. Then Gareth had come through her supply room, senior warrior, broad across the shoulders, the kind of person who moved through spaces as if ownership were a matter of physical confidence. He had helped himself to 3 wound wrap units from the week's prepared allocation, explaining when she noted this, that the East Hall needed them, and she should prepare more. She had nodded. She had prepared more. She had stood at the table with her hands working steadily, and something in the back of her mind saying, quietly and repeatedly, "You are good at what you do. This is simply how things work here. You know this." It was not an inspiring thing to need to tell yourself, but it was true, and truth was reliable, even when it was not particularly warm. Then Elder Petra, in the corridor at 3 in the afternoon. Elder Petra was one of the pack's 3 elders, small, upright, very old in the way that produced sharpness rather than softness. She had said that someone had mentioned Nora's evening visits to the East Wing, and she wanted to be sure Nora understood the East Wing was not a general-use corridor. Nora had said yes, said she would stop if it was a problem, had meant it, as much as she could mean anything that would cost her something considerable. Elder Petra had been quiet for a moment, that lasted longer than it looked, then had said it was not a problem, had walked away without explaining the silence between the question and the answer, which left Nora holding a puzzle she could not assemble with the information she had. She had come to the East Wing anyway, the way she came every evening. Some things had passed the point of requiring fresh decisions. She read for a full hour from the Alpine Chuff chapter. The bird was extraordinary, highly intelligent, playful in the technical and genuine sense, documented by the naturalist who wrote this section to have developed and transmitted tool behaviors across generations. She read about a pair observed opening latches on storage boxes and teaching their young to do the same, and the naturalist's delight was visible in every sentence, and she shared it and said so. She said, "He is very pleased with himself for watching this, and he should be." She said, "I think that when an animal does something that has no survival purpose, and is only for the pleasure of the doing, that is worth more attention than almost anything else." She said it, and believed it, and looked at Greystone's still amber eyes, and let the silence be what it was. Then she talked about her day. She did it without drama, in the tone of someone reporting honestly, rather than seeking a response. Cole and his ribs, Gareth and his efficient entitlement, Elder Petra and her unfinished sentences. She said, "Some days the edges of what I am in this place are very clear." And then she said, because the room was the room it was, and she had been circling this for 3 months, "My father used to smell like sawdust and the river. I do not remember what work he did, but I remember the smell of it on his hands and his shirt. My mother braided my hair on Sunday mornings, and she sang the same song every time, and I cannot hear it clearly anymore, but I can almost hear the melody if I try, some days." She sat with that for a while. The room sat with it. The snow came while she was on the 2nd chapter's final pages. She saw it in her peripheral vision first, white movement against the black of the window. She leaned slightly and looked out. Small flakes, moving sideways on the wind. The first snow of the season, thin enough that it would not stick, but real enough to be there. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at Greystone. "First snow of the year," she said. "It started just now. The pines look like someone dusted the needles." She read one more page. She said goodnight. She tucked the blanket edges. She turned down one lantern and left the other at its lowest setting, which she always did. She let herself out into the cold corridor and walked back through the manor to her quarters, passing through the sounds of the pack's evening without stopping in any of them. And she lay down on her bed and thought about her father's smell, and her mother's song, and the first snow on the pines, and she fell asleep before she meant to. In 9 days, at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday, the Alpha King's convoy would come through the Iron Crest Gate. She did not know that yet. She did not know that 9 days of evenings were what remained before the room she had made her own became something larger than what she had made it. She only knew the ceiling above her bed, and the smell of snow coming through the gap in her window, and the sound of the pack settling into its night around her, and these things were sufficient, and she slept. The healing rooms had a particular smell in the mornings that Nora associated with the best parts of her day. Pine resin and dried lavender, and something underlying both of them that she had never identified precisely, but suspected was the accumulated scent of years of careful work done in a specific space, the residue of attention itself, which had its own smell, the way bread had a smell, and libraries had a smell, and cold stone after rain had a smell. She had come to work before 6 for 6 years, and the smell still arrived fresh each morning, unchanged, welcoming her the way places welcomed people who had earned belonging in them through simple repetition. She was at the preparation table by 6:15, working through the supply list Lena had left the previous evening. 2 shelves to restock, a full batch of the inflammation tonic to start. It needed 3 days of settling before it was ready to use, which meant today was the last possible day to begin it, if it was going to be available by the end of the week. She measured and poured with the unhurried efficiency she had developed over years of making things that had to be made correctly, or not at all. Healing work did not accommodate haste. Haste in healing work was the path to remedies that did nothing, or, worse, did the wrong thing. She had learned this early, and had made patience the foundational habit of everything she did in this room. Lena arrived at 6:30 with 2 cups of tea, which was her daily way of transitioning from the territory of sleep into the territory of work. She handed one to Nora without ceremony, and settled on the high stool by the south window, where the morning light came in at the angle she preferred. They worked in companionable quiet for a while, Nora at the preparation table, and Lena reviewing the week's case notes with the reading spectacles she pretended she did not need, and had been pretending for 2 years. Cole sent a message via one of the younger pack members at 7:30 to report that he was following his rest instructions, and also to ask whether the inflammation tonic could be made faster if the temperature of the settling environment was increased. Nora wrote back, no. She included nothing else because nothing else was necessary. It was in the middle of the morning, while she was organizing the restocked shelves into the precise order she maintained, the order that allowed her to find anything in the dark or in a hurry without thinking about it, that she thought about the question she had been circling for the past week without directly asking it. She had never looked at the formal care records for the East Wing. The manor kept records of everything. It was one of the things she had learned early about large organized households. They documented treatments, supplies, inspections, official visits. The elder room would have a record somewhere. She could ask Lena. Lena had been here longer than almost anyone except the oldest members of the pack, and knew where information lived. But asking Lena would mean explaining why she wanted to know, and explaining why she wanted to know would mean talking about what she had allowed herself to know the previous evening, and she was not ready for that conversation yet. She needed to carry it herself for a while longer, before she made it available to anyone else. She finished the shelves, and went to find the administrative records herself. The manor's documentation room was in the main corridor off the Great Hall, managed by a quiet woman named Marette, who had been keeping the pack's records for 30 years, and who treated the documents in her care with the reverence of a librarian for primary sources. Nora had been in there occasionally for healers' records, the treatment logs she submitted each week, the supply requisitions, the annual stock reports. Marette knew her face, and had always been efficient and unobtrusive in her dealings with her. She asked Marette, with the neutral tone she used when she needed information that was not exactly her business to ask for, whether there was a record of the last official welfare check conducted on the elder room animals. Marette considered this briefly, then turned to the long shelving unit along the far wall and pulled a narrow ledger from the third shelf. She opened it to the relevant section, ran her finger down the entries, and then paused. Nora looked at where Marette's finger had stopped. The last entry was dated 2 years and 3 months ago, initialed with a mark she did not recognize, which meant it had been done by someone in the pack's formal structure, a senior member, probably a warrior assigned to the duty as a formality. There were no entries after it. 2 years and 3 months of blank page. She thanked Marette and left. She stood in the main corridor for a moment and let the number settle in her. 2 years and 3 months. Not the casual absence she might have imagined. Someone meaning to visit and putting it off. The busy life of a pack at war. 2 years and 3 months was a structured absence, a decided one. She went back to the healing rooms and finished her day's work. In the evening, she brought the Naturalist Letters of Henry Marsh to the East Wing for the first time. She had started the book 2 days earlier and had found Henry Marsh to be exactly the kind of company she appreciated, enthusiastic without being performative, precise without being cold, delighted by the things he studied in a way that communicated itself through every sentence he wrote, as if delight were the most natural condition in which to do scientific work. He had spent 3 years observing a family of golden eagles and had written about them the way people wrote about things they loved, not trying to make them more impressive than they were, because they were already impressive, but trying to show exactly what they were, so the reader could feel the impressiveness directly. She read about the first season of eagle observation, the long cold mornings at the research point above the tree line, the gradual development of familiarity between the observer and the observed. Henry Marsh wrote about earning the trust of wild animals with the patience and humility that trust actually required, not trying to make yourself unthreatening through tricks or strategies, but simply being present, regularly and calmly, until the animal's experience of you shifted from threat to weather. You were a fact of the environment, and then, if you were fortunate and careful, you became a fact of the environment that could be ignored. And that, he wrote, was the beginning of seeing something real. She stopped after 2 chapters and set the book on her knee. She looked at Greystone. The record in Merritt's ledger sat in her mind with the solidity of things that explained other things. 2 years and 3 months without an official visit. No entry in the record. The bond between an alpha and his spirit wolf was not a private matter. Spirit wolves were part of the pack's structure, part of its continuity. Their care was a formal duty as much as an emotional one. For that duty to simply stop, without record, without reassignment, without any official acknowledgement, it spoke of something deliberately not being addressed. She thought about the note of absence that had been present in the room since the first evening she had come here. Not just the wolf's stillness, but the particular quality of the stillness. Not the stillness of something resting, but the stillness of something that had been alone so long it had stopped expecting anything from the air around it. She reached over and adjusted the blanket on Greystone's flank. Her hand rested there for a moment. She said, quietly, "I know why you have been alone. I do not think it was because you were not loved. I think it was because the person who loved you could not look at what had happened and keep doing the other things that needed to be done. And I think that is a kind of grief that is very hard to explain to someone who has never been in a war." She sat with this for a while. The lanterns were warm. The wind outside was cold and the snow from the night before had not stayed, as she had predicted, but the air still carried its memory. She said, "I want to tell you something I have not said aloud before, because this room is the room where I say things I do not say elsewhere. I have been in this pack for 18 years, and I have been grateful for the safety it gave me, and I have done good work inside it, and I do not regret any of it. And also, some days, I feel the shape of what I am not, in a way that takes something from me. Not every day, not even most days. But some days when Gareth walks through my supply room without asking, or when Cole looks at me to assess whether my instructions carry weight, or when I sit in the common room and feel the shape of every bond in the room that does not include me, some of those days the cost is real." She breathed out slowly. "I am telling you this because I think this room can hold it, and because I think you understand something about being in a place where the bonds run in directions you cannot follow, even if the reasons are different, even if the situation is nothing like mine." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Also, Henry Marsh has just described in very precise terms how a pair of golden eagles coordinate a hunt, and it is extraordinary. I will read it to you in a moment." She read the hunting chapter in its entirety. It was, as she had predicted, extraordinary. Henry Marsh's precision in describing the division of roles between the two birds, one driving, one waiting, the communication between them so subtle it looked to the observer like synchronicity rather than communication, made the hunt visible in a way that left her sitting forward in her chair. She read with more energy than usual, and when she finished, she said, "Remarkable," and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment before looking at Greystone. He lay exactly as he always lay, silver and still in the lantern light. She had thought, in her first weeks of coming here, that she was waiting for some sign, some indication that her presence registered, that the reading landed somewhere, that the room's one other permanent occupant was receiving what she brought. She had looked for it and not found it, and gradually stopped looking. Not because she had given up, but because she had understood, somewhere around week 3, that looking for a sign was the wrong orientation. You did not come to a room to receive a response. You came to a room to be in a room with something that deserved company. The response was not the point. The company was the point. She had been in the pack for 18 years, and she knew, better than most things, what it meant to be present in a space without being the center of it. She was, in some ways, very good at that. The evening moved into its later hours. She talked about the cold that had settled into the manor's stone walls, the way it came in through the old places, the gaps at the window frames, the seam between 2 sections of wall in the north corridor that had been imperfectly repaired and let in a thread of winter air that nobody had gotten around to addressing. She talked about the alpine plant guide she had finished and returned to the library, and the mountain bird guide that had replaced it, and the way she chose her books, which was mostly by standing in the library with no particular intention and waiting for a spine to catch her eye, which was not a very systematic approach, but had not yet failed her. She was in the middle of a thought about river systems. She had been thinking about the river history book she had read in August, and how the chapter on underground rivers had stayed with her. The idea of something important and real, flowing through the dark unseen for miles before it came to the surface, when she became aware that she had been sitting in the east wing for nearly 3 hours, which was longer than usual. She stretched, she stood, she put her book away and adjusted the blankets with the same care she always brought to it, checking the edges, smoothing the surface. She stood at the cedar bed for a moment before she left. She thought about the record in Maret's ledger. 2 years and 3 months of blank page. She thought about what it cost a person to leave a blank where a name should be. She said, before she turned toward the door, "I am going to keep coming, not because I am owed anything for it, not because I expect anything from it, just because this is right. Whatever that means in the larger picture of things that are and are not possible in this place, it is right, and I know right from wrong, at least that precisely." She let herself out. The corridor was cold and dim. She walked back through the manor, past the common rooms where the pack's evening was winding down, past the north staircase where a lantern had gone out and needed replacing. She made a mental note to mention it to the maintenance staff. Then she went to her quarters and washed her face and sat on her bed and thought about underground rivers and what it meant for something real to flow unseen for a very long time before it finally broke into light. She fell asleep thinking she had 4 more days before the convoy came through the gate. She had 4 days. She used every one of them in the East Wing in the evenings, and she read Henry Marsh's letters through to their end, and began the Mountain Bird Guide, and she said more things to Greystone in those 4 days that she had not said to anyone in years. And on the 4th day, in the afternoon, the Alpha King's convoy appeared on the road from the north, and the manor felt its arrival in its walls, before a single vehicle had passed through the gate, and the world that Nora had built carefully, in the space of 5 months, and the world that was about to come through the gate, met at the boundary of those 4 remaining days, and held there, briefly, before the boundary dissolved. The cars came through the Iron Crest Gate at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and Nora heard the change in the manor before she heard the vehicles. It was not a sound exactly. It was a shift in the quality of the air inside the building, the particular alteration that happened in large, organized households when something significant was about to occur. A collective intake of breath that had no single source and no deliberate coordination, but was real nonetheless, and unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough time inside those walls to know their ordinary rhythms. She was at the preparation table, labeling the tonic bottles from the batch that had finished its 3-day settling. She was writing in the careful small print she used for labels, spelling out the contents and the date of preparation and the recommended dosage, when the shift happened. Her hand did not stop. She finished the label, capped the bottle, set it in its correct place on the shelf, and looked out the window. The corner of the courtyard was visible from this window. Just the corner, the iron gate pillar and the edge of the flagstone. The first vehicle came through while she was watching. Dark, road-dusted, moving steadily. Then another. A third. She watched long enough to see the third vehicle's door open and someone begin to step out, and then she deliberately looked back at her bottles. It was not her business. It was pack leadership business, and she had 18 years of practiced understanding that pack leadership business was not something she had standing in, and she had learned to hold that understanding without bitterness, because bitterness was expensive, and she had other things to spend herself on. She finished labeling. She cleaned the preparation surface. She reorganized the measuring instruments in their correct order. She was good at staying in the work. Lena came in, 20 minutes later with the report. 28 returning warriors, 3 requiring immediate medical attention, and 1 case significant enough that the Alpha King's personal guard had requested the senior healer attend without delay. Lena was already assembling her field kit. Nora reached past her and added the supplies for deep joint injuries, which was what 3/4 of returning soldiers presented with after extended field campaigns. The accumulated damage of sustained physical demand on joints that had been pushed past their reasonable limits for too long. They went to the main hall together. The hall was loud, in a way it was not usually loud. Not disorganized noise but layered noise, voices finding each other after long absence. The particular pitch of relief, the sound of a group of people who had been in danger together and were now in safety together and were only beginning to understand the difference. Nora moved through it carefully, staying behind Lena's broader figure, keeping to the edges, watching the floor in front of her feet rather than the faces of the people filling the room. She was aware, at the peripheral edge of her attention, of something anchoring the room, a quality of organization around a center. She did not look for it directly. She and Lena moved through the side door into the treatment room, and she did not look. For the next 3 hours she worked. The joint cases were as she had expected. The infected cut was worse than the initial report had suggested. Several weeks of field neglect on a wound that had needed proper treatment from the beginning, now requiring daily cleaning and a course of the stronger botanical preparation that she would have to make fresh in the morning. A hand fracture that had been wrapped in the field with something that had allowed the wrong alignment to set, which was going to require careful intervention and a longer healing period than a clean break would have. She did the work with full attention, asking the clinical questions that gave her the information she needed, explaining treatment plans in clear and direct terms, writing her notes in the margin of the case ledger she had brought from the healing room. She heard the voice once. She was carrying the supply case from the treatment table to the washstand when voices came from the larger room beyond the connecting door, and one of them separated itself from the others with a quality that was not louder or more aggressive but simply cleaner, more distinct, like a single note in a chord that you could follow without trying. She caught perhaps 4 words before the sound moved away into the general noise of the hall. She did not catch their meaning. She caught their quality, which was precise, and beneath the precision, carried something flat and pressed down that she recognized professionally. The register exhaustion built in a voice when the person had decided not to acknowledge it. She set the supply case on the washstand and went back to her patient. The work was done by early evening. She and Lena gathered their materials, wrote the final notes in the case ledger, and walked back through the hall, which had quieted from its earlier volume into the lower, more dispersed sound of a group of people beginning to separate into their individual evenings. Nora kept her eyes on the corridor ahead. She went to the east wing. She read from the Mountain Bird Guide. She talked about the changed energy in the manor, how even the corridors had felt different on the walk back from the main hall, as if the building itself had rearranged its expectations. She said she thought a place held the shape of the people who filled it, and that certain people shaped a place more than others, not through any particular effort, but simply through the intensity of their presence, the way a strong current shaped a riverbed. She said, "I heard his voice once today. Just a few words. He sounds like someone who has been making decisions for a very long time without adequate rest." She paused. Then she said, "That is a clinical observation, not a judgment." She read until the lanterns needed oil, refilled them, and went to bed. The next 4 days told her things about the Alpha King that he had not spoken to her and was not going to speak to her, because they did not know each other and were unlikely to, in any meaningful way. She gathered her information the way she had always gathered information about the large forces that shaped her environment, from the edge, from what was observable without direct access, from the behavior of people adjacent to the center. What she observed, Idris moved faster than he usually moved, which meant he was covering more ground per hour than his ordinary pace, which meant the incoming information was dense and required rapid response. The senior warriors were gathering in different formations than usual, smaller groups, more private spaces, which suggested they were being briefed rather than assembled. The household staff was preparing the Alpha King's formal chambers, which she had known were in the east corridor of the main building, and the preparation had been ongoing for 2 days. which was a longer preparation than she would have expected for a room that had presumably been maintained in his absence. She saw him 3 times in those first 4 days. The first time was in the main corridor, at a distance of perhaps 20 feet. He was walking with 2 senior warriors, talking, and she was coming from the opposite direction, with a tray of supplies for the follow-up appointments. He did not look at her. She did not expect him to. She looked at him briefly, and directly, and noted what she noted. He moved without urgency, but covered ground quickly, the efficiency of someone who wasted nothing including motion. His face was not harsh. It was worn. There was a difference, and she knew it from the healing rooms. Worn was something that happened to a face over time, when the person had been asked to bear a great deal, without asking for acknowledgement of the bearing. Harsh was a choice. Worn was an accumulation. The second time was from across the great hall at the brief pack assembly that Idris had called on the 3rd day, the customary gathering after an alpha's return, a formal acknowledgement that the leadership was present and active. She stood at the back of the hall, where she always stood at assemblies, and he stood at the front and spoke to the pack about the winter preparations and the border situation and several administrative matters that affected the pack's daily functioning. His voice in the hall was the voice she had heard in the main corridor at its edge, clear and direct, with no wasted words and no performance. He said what he needed to say without ornamentation. The pack listened with the focused attention of people whose trust in authority was real, rather than obligated. She studied him for the 10 minutes of the assembly, with the attention she brought to things she needed to understand. The exhaustion she had noted was still present, visible to her eyes, if not necessarily to others. There was also something else, something she found harder to name, something underneath the competence and the controlled authority. A quality of withholding, perhaps. The sense of a person who was fully present in the room they occupied, and also, simultaneously, not quite fully arrived somewhere in themselves. She understood that quality. She had seen it in patients who were recovering from something difficult and had not yet found the path to the last part of the recovery, the part that required acknowledging what had happened, rather than simply continuing past it. The 3rd time she saw him was from a window. She was coming down the east corridor staircase on the 4th day when she saw him below, crossing the courtyard in the late afternoon dark. He was alone, which was unusual for an alpha in his first week back. They were generally surrounded by the logistical activity of a return. He was walking without destination, which she could tell from the pace, which was the pace of someone who needed to move, rather than the pace of someone going somewhere. He had his hands in the pockets of his coat. He looked at the flagstones rather than at the horizon. She watched him cross the courtyard and disappear around the east wall of the manor, toward the area where the pine trees came closest to the building. She did not know then what he was going toward or what he was avoiding. She only noted it the way she noted things she did not yet have the context to interpret, and she filed it and went back to her rounds. That evening in the East Wing, she read about the ptarmigan, which changed the color of its feathers entirely between summer and winter, brown in warm months to match the rock and heather, white in cold months to match the snow. Henry, the naturalist, had spent a chapter on the precision of this change, the chemical signaling that triggered it, the exact degree of daylight reduction that began the process. She read the chapter, and then she talked about adaptation for a while, how certain things did it by changing their appearance, and certain things did it by changing their behavior, and certain things did it by finding a room at the end of a corridor that asked nothing of them, and being themselves inside it. She said, "I have been thinking about what it means to be very tired of something, and still be required to be excellent at it. I think it is one of the hardest forms of discipline there is. I think it costs more than is visible from the outside." She sat with the mountain bird guide on her knee, and the lanterns burning warmly around her, and Greystone on his cedar bed in his silver stillness, and she said nothing else for a while. She was not prepared for what happened later. She had closed the bird guide and was gathering her things, had put on her coat, and was reaching for her canvas bag, when she heard footsteps in the East Wing corridor. This was unusual. The East Wing was not a corridor anyone had reason to use in the late evening hours. She heard them approach, slow, not hurried, the footsteps of someone who had arrived at the East Wing entrance and was walking the length of the corridor, perhaps not entirely certain of their destination. She went very still. The footsteps came closer. They passed the second storage room door, the third. They slowed as they approached the elder room. and she could see in the gap under the door that the light in the corridor outside had brightened slightly as someone brought a lantern nearer. Then the footsteps stopped. She held herself completely still in the center of the elder room, her coat on, her bag in her hand, one lantern still burning beside the cedar bed. She looked at the gap under the door. The light held for a long moment, stayed, without the door opening, just the faint additional glow of a second lantern through the gap, and the footsteps that had stopped and were now simply not moving. She counted in her head. She reached 30. She reached 40. The light did not move. Then it began to diminish. The footsteps resumed, soft and retreating, back the way they had come, down the east wing corridor to the entrance, and then they were gone. She let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. She stood in the room for another minute. Then she adjusted Greystone's blankets, turned down the remaining lantern, and let herself out into the empty corridor. She walked back to her quarters in the cold of the later evening, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before lying down. She thought about footsteps that arrived and did not enter. She thought about a figure crossing the courtyard alone in the late afternoon dark, not going anywhere, just needing to move. She thought about an entry in Merritt's ledger that had stopped 2 years and 3 months ago and had not resumed. She thought, he is close. He is getting closer. And whatever he is approaching, he is not yet ready to arrive. She lay down. She fell asleep more slowly than usual, and she did not know that in the main building's east corridor, in the formal chambers at its end, a man had sat down at the window of his room and looked out at the pine trees for a long time in the dark, and had not slept until well past midnight, and had woken before dawn, and had started another day that would ask him to be excellent at things that cost him more than was visible from the outside. A full week passed. The manor settled into the rhythm of an alpha's active residence, the way a river settled into a new channel, with some initial turbulence, and then a gradual establishment of flow that had always been intended to be there, as if the previous arrangement had been a temporary deviation, rather than its own complete thing. Idris moved differently, with more deliberate pacing, his efficiency now in service of coordination, rather than carrying everything himself. The senior warriors had a quality of readiness about them that had been present before, but was sharper now. The particular attentiveness of people whose authority's source was present and observing. The household had a new tidiness that was not anxious but was considered, aware that eyes that mattered were on the building. Nora moved through all of it, the way she always moved through the pack's larger patterns, adjacent, observant, doing the work that the day asked for, causing no disruption to the patterns she was not part of, and expecting none from them. Cole's ribs were healing well. She confirmed this on his 4th-day follow-up, which he had actually attended voluntarily, which she noted with private satisfaction. He had come into the healing room in the mid-morning, sat on the examination table without being told to, and let her remove the wrap and assess the healing without any of the performative resistance she had expected. He was quieter than usual. She probed the fractures gently, asked the clinical questions, received his answers, and was preparing to re-wrap when he said, without looking at her directly, "Everyone is talking about the East Wing." She kept her hands moving, unspooling the clean wrap with the even tension she maintained. She said, "What are they saying about it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That the healer goes there every night. To the old wolf's room." He paused again, as if deciding something. Then, "I didn't know about the old wolf. I knew the Alpha King had a spirit wolf. That was just something people mentioned. But I didn't know where he was, or anything about him. Is it true he has been alone in that room for a long time?" She finished the first pass of the wrap before she answered. Then she said, "I think that is something you would have to ask someone with more information about it than I have." Cole accepted this. He was young, but he was not unintelligent. He understood when a non-answer was the honest answer that could be given. He slid off the table, tested the tightness of the wrap with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been wrapped before, and thanked her. Then, at the door, he turned and looked at her with an expression she did not fully understand, something that was not admiration exactly, and not surprise exactly, but was somewhere in the territory between them. He said, "You have been going every night? Since before anyone knew about it?" She looked at him steadily. She said, 5 months. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once, with a quality to the nod that was different from his usual manner, and left. She stood at the examination table for a moment after he was gone, thinking about what he had not said, which seemed to contain something. The day moved through its hours. She treated a minor burn from the kitchen, checked in on the warrior with the infected hand wound, prepared the fresh batch of the stronger botanical preparation she had promised. She did the afternoon rounds in the East residential quarters. She wrote up her case notes in the log. At 3 in the afternoon, she was in the storage room, reorganizing the supply inventory that the previous week's soldier treatments had disrupted, when she heard him in the corridor. She did not see him. The storage room door was ajar, not open, and the corridor outside was visible only as a narrow slice of dim stone and lantern light. But she heard him speaking, a short exchange with someone, 2 or 3 sentences from each party, then footsteps moving on. His voice again, that same quality, direct and slightly worn, the flat note of sustained effort underneath the clarity. She listened to it until it moved out of range. Then she went back to the inventory. She thought about what she was doing. She stopped thinking about it. She went back to the inventory. The pack assembly Idris had called for the second week of the return was held the following day, a midday gathering, rather than an evening one, dealing with the winter preparations in earnest. Nora attended as she always attended pack assemblies. At the back wall, in the reliable position of someone who was present without being part of the functional core of the meeting. She watched the front of the hall where the Alpha King stood with Idris and the 3 elders, and laid out the coming season's requirements in precise terms, the supply calculations, the boundary patrol adjustments, the allocation of the construction crews for the 2 projects that needed to be done before the deep cold arrived. She watched him for the 30 minutes of the assembly, with the particular sustained attention she had been bringing to this task since his arrival. She was building a picture from available evidence, the way she built pictures of patients she did not yet understand, not guessing, not inferring beyond what she could support, but accumulating what was observable until the shape of the thing became clear. What was observable, he did not use more words than a situation required. He did not perform authority, which distinguished him from people who had authority but were less sure of it. He watched the room while he spoke, which meant he was receiving information at the same time he was giving it. His default expression was neutral, in the specific way that neutral was a discipline rather than a feeling, not the blankness of someone who felt nothing but the controlled surface of someone who had learned to feel carefully in public. And underneath all of it, consistent across every sighting over the past 10 days, the presence of something pressed down, something he was maintaining a structural separation from. She had seen this before. Not in her healing work specifically, because what she treated was physical, but in the longer arc of caring for people, the pattern of someone who had experienced something that required processing and who had, instead of processing it, built a temporary wall around it and continued functioning on the other side of the wall. The wall worked, the functioning was genuine, but the wall required maintenance, and maintenance was expensive, and the expense showed in a person's eyes, and the flat note of their voice, and the particular quality of solitude she had seen in a figure crossing a courtyard alone in the late afternoon dark. She was not in a position to say any of this to anyone. She filed it with the other things she held carefully. That evening she was far into Henry Marsh's letters, deep into his second winter of eagle observation. He had begun, by this point in the letters, to speak more openly about the effect of the work on his own inner life. How spending 3 years in close proximity to animals, who were completely and only themselves, had made him more aware of the ways human beings were not, the layers of construction and performance and management that human life required. He wrote about sitting in the cold at 4 in the morning, watching a pair of eagles, and feeling the particular relief of being in the presence of something that did not need to be explained or managed, that simply was what it was, with the complete consistency of wild things. She read this passage twice. Then she set the book on the chair arm and looked at Greystone for a while. She said, "I think I understand what he means. I think this room is something like that for me. You have never asked me to be anything particular in order to be here. You have never assessed me or placed me in a category or made me feel the edges of what I am. You are simply what you are, and you let me be what I am, and that is more valuable than I know how to say." She sat with that. Then she said, because she had been thinking about it since the Cole conversation, "I am also aware that the person this room belongs to has been very close to it for 10 days now, and has not come in, and I do not know what is between him and this room, and I am not going to pretend I do. But I think that whatever it is very heavy, and I think the weight of it has been on him for a long time." She picked up the book. She found her page. She did not know, as she read, that at that moment in the East Wing corridor outside the door, a figure had come to a stop. Kalen had been in his rooms. He had tried to work on the supply reports, had genuinely tried, sitting at his desk with the documents in front of him and his pen in his hand, and the numbers had remained numbers and had refused to become anything else, which was what happened when a mind was occupied with something it was not permitted to address directly. He had put the pen down. He had walked. He had found himself in the East Wing corridor with no specific memory of deciding to go there. He stood at the door. This time he could hear the words. The door was not a tight fit in its frame. The old wood and old stone had settled unevenly over the decades, and the gap was wide enough that voices in the room carried. He had noticed this the first night he had stood here, when he had caught the rhythm of reading but not the words. Tonight he was closer. He had come closer than last time. He had not been conscious of doing this as an approach, but it had been one. He heard her say, "I think this room is something like that for me. You have never asked me to be anything particular in order to be here." He stood in the corridor and listened. He heard her pause. He heard her say something about wait and a long time. He heard the sound of a page turning. Then her voice settled into reading, steady and unhurried, and he stood in the corridor and listened to it until she reached the end of the chapter. He was there for 40 minutes. When she paused at the end of the chapter and the quality of the silence inside the room shifted, the particular shift that meant someone was preparing to leave, he stepped back from the door and moved quietly back down the corridor to its entrance and out into the main passage. He went to his rooms. He sat at his window in the dark and looked at the pine trees for a long time. He thought about a woman's voice saying, "You let me be what I am." He thought about it with the part of him that was not managing anything, the part that was simply receiving. He was on the floor of his rooms before he knew he had moved, sitting against the wall with his back to the cold stone, his knees drawn up, his forearms resting on them. The same posture he had used, years ago, at difficult moments in the field, when he had needed to think, without the performance of thinking clearly. Just the wall and the cold and the dark and whatever was true. He said to himself, quietly, in the dark of his rooms, "You are going to have to go into that room." He knew it. He had known it since the convoy had come through the gate, probably before. Probably since the bond had snapped on the northern ridge and he had gone back to the battle and not named it. He told himself, not tonight. He got up. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the manor settle around him, the sounds of the building at its late-night depth, and he was awake for a very long time, and he did not dream, which was its own kind of mercy. He said to himself, just before he slept, tomorrow. He did not go the next day. He did not go the day after that. He went the day after that day, and he stood in the corridor and heard her voice, and did not open the door, and walked back to his rooms. And then he went 3 more evenings and did the same thing, close enough to hear the words, not close enough to turn the handle. On the 7th day after the night at the wall, he decided he was done with the corridor. He was going in. He told himself this in the morning while he was dressing, simply and without room for negotiation, and he went through his day with that decision in place, like a nail in a board, fixed, not moving, not subject to adjustment. That evening he had meetings until 10. The meetings were real and necessary, and could not have been moved. He went through them with his full attention, which was what he was capable of when he needed it to be true. At 10 he said goodnight to Idris, and walked through the manor toward the East Wing. He told himself, tonight. But at the entrance to the East Wing corridor, he stopped. He heard her voice from deep inside, reading, steady, unhurried, exactly as it had been every time. And something in him said, not like this. Not while she is in there. Not as an interruption of the things she has built in that room, arriving at her door like someone inserting himself into something that was not made for him. He turned and walked back to his rooms. He stood at his window for a long time. He said, in the dark, to nothing, "You are going to have to do this when the room is empty, when there is no one else to witness the first moment of it." He understood that he was delaying. He also understood that some delays were not avoidance but preparation, and he was no longer entirely certain which kind this was. He only knew that he was not yet where he needed to be, and that whatever was required to get there was still in process, and that the process was moving, which was the important thing. It was moving. He was getting closer. He went to bed and slept very badly, and was up before dawn and went through another day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and each day brought him closer to the door, in a way that had nothing to do with the corridor, and everything to do with the work that a person did inside themselves when they were preparing to look at something they had not been able to look at for a very long time. November had arrived with real cold and no apology. The thin autumn that had preceded it, that had kept the days mild into the late part of the month, had finally given way, all at once on a Sunday night, and Monday morning had come in with frost on the window glass, and ice along the stone edges of the courtyard, and an air temperature that meant every person in the manor began the day by checking whether the pipes in the north corridor had frozen again, which they had, which meant 3 hours of practical management before the real work could start. Nora had spent the first week of November the way she spent every transition of serious weather, busier than usual in the healing rooms, fielding the minor ailments that came with cold and closed spaces, preparing the increased stock of respiratory remedy that always needed to be ready by the second week of November, and additionally, managing the ice-related injuries that the frost had produced in the courtyard in the first morning alone. 2 sprained ankles, a fractured wrist on a kitchen worker who had caught herself against the courtyard wall, a constellation of bruises spread across several people who had each independently decided that the ice was not as solid as it looked, and then discovered it was more solid than they had anticipated. She had also been managing Cole, who had graduated from rib patient to unofficial morning presence in the healing room hallway, appearing at intervals with non-urgent requests that she suspected were not entirely about healing, and treating her now with a kind of careful respect that she found both pleasant and slightly awkward, because she did not know quite what to do with it. He had started calling her Nora. This was a small thing and she was not going to make much of it. She had also been tired. The real tiredness that came from a week of longer hours and interrupted sleep. The previous Thursday someone had needed attention at 2 in the morning, that had not been a medical emergency but had presented as one, and she had spent 3 hours in the healing room and then gone back to her quarters and lain awake until 5, because her body had decided it was no longer interested in sleeping, and her mind had agreed. She had been running slightly behind herself ever since. It was Tuesday evening. The frost outside was dense enough to make the windows opaque at their edges with a thin lattice of ice crystals. Inside the east wing, the stone walls had absorbed enough of the week's cold that even the lanterns could not entirely counter it, and Nora had put on her heaviest coat before coming down the corridor. The long gray one she used for night calls in winter, that went almost to her ankles, and had deep pockets she had stuffed with the dried lavender sachets she kept in everything that went into cold rooms as a habit from her healer's training. She had draped the full pile of blankets from the spare bed over Greystone, all 4 of them, layered with the lightest on top so the weight was graduated. She had tucked each edge carefully. She had adjusted the lanterns to their highest setting, which they were not usually on because she was frugal with the oil, but tonight, the room needed whatever warmth she could give it. She was nearly at the end of Henry Marsh's letters. She had been reading him for 3 weeks, and had grown genuinely fond of him as a presence in the room. His enthusiasm was the kind that did not require a response from its audience. His precision was the kind that illuminated rather than flattened, and his willingness to say when something moved him had given the letters a quality of company that most books did not quite achieve. She was going to be sorry to finish him, which was the mark of having read something good. Tonight she was in the final section, the closing letters of the last winter of his mountain residence. He was preparing to descend, to return to the city where he would write his formal reports, and the letters had taken on the particular quality of something ending, more reflective, more willing to step back from the immediate and look at the larger shape of what the time had been. He had not known it would be the last morning until he was back in camp, and the weather had closed, and he had not been able to return. He had written about this, the accidental nature of final things, how rarely you knew, while you were inside them, that you were inside the last of something. He wrote, "The last morning was an ordinary morning. The sun was at its usual angle, and the birds moved in their usual way, and there was nothing in the air that said this would be the one I would carry forward from all the others. I think this is perhaps the right way for last things to be. If we knew they were last, we would try to hold them, and they would not be themselves." She looked up from the page. The room was its usual still and cedar-scented self. The blankets on Greystone rose in a small, soft mountain of wool. His amber eyes held their fixed, distant gaze. Outside, the frost had made the window glass look like frosted lamp panels. opaque and softly luminous from the courtyard lights beyond. She thought about what Henry Marsh had written. She thought about ordinary mornings and how you carried them without knowing you were carrying them. She thought about the first evening she had come into this room and stood in the doorway for 2 minutes, and about how that evening had been entirely unremarkable in every way, except that it had turned out to be the beginning of something she could not have anticipated. She talked for a while. She talked about the snow that was going to come properly in the next few days. She could feel it in the air now, a particular quality of the cold that meant moisture held in suspension, the cold that came before real snowfall, rather than the dry cold that simply settled. She said the pine trees were going to be extraordinary when the snow came. She said she had a specific spot in the East Hall corridor where you could see the tallest group of pines from the upper window, and in a real snowfall, that view was the kind of thing that made you stand at the window longer than you had meant to. Her voice had been slowing for the last 20 minutes. She was aware of it, and told herself to turn to the next page rather than talking, because reading kept her voice at its usual pace better than talking did. She found her page. She read the next letter, which was Henry Marsh's account of the journey down the mountain, the descent through the tree line, the first night at the lower camp, where the air was thicker and warmer, and tasted different from the high-altitude air he had been breathing for months. He wrote, "I had not realized how completely I had adapted to the mountain until I was below it. The body adjusts so fully and so quietly that the adjustment becomes the self, and you don't know there has been a change until you change back. Coming down was a kind of loss, even though I was going toward what I had come from. Maybe because of that." She turned the page to the final letter, Henry Marsh's last entry from the research period, written from the lower camp on the last morning before the main descent. He wrote about the red deer that had been visiting the camp periodically since October, a family of 4, a female and 3 young males, who had grown comfortable enough with the camp's presence to bed down within 50 yards of it on cold nights. He wrote, "This morning I woke before dawn to find them bedded within 30 feet of my tent, the closest they had ever come. They lay with the easy stillness of animals deeply at rest, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. I lay in my sleeping roll and watched them for 20 minutes without moving. They knew I was there. I could see the female's awareness of me in the occasional slight angle of her ears, but they did not consider me a threat. I was simply a fact of the environment, something they had learned over months of careful observation on their part to be predictable and harmless. To be trusted enough by a wild creature that it rests near you without adjusting its behavior for your presence. I think this may be the finest thing I have ever been given by this work. Not the data, not the reports. This, the simple, complete trust of something that had every reason to be cautious, and had chosen, on the basis of evidence, not to be." Nora's voice had gone very slow on the last paragraph. She was aware of it the way you were aware of sleep arriving, not able to stop it exactly, only aware of the approach. She kept reading. She reached the end of the paragraph, the period at the end of the last sentence. She turned the page. There was one more paragraph. She read the first sentence of it. It was about the deer getting up at dawn and moving into the trees, and there was something about the particular quality of the morning light, and her voice found the second clause of the sentence, and then the words became something else entirely, and she was asleep. Not gradually. All at once, the way the truly tired fell, completely and without ceremony. The book remained balanced on her knee, held by the habit of her fingers even in sleep, her head tilted to the side, following the angle of deep rest, and came to rest against the cedar frame of Greystone's bed, where she had moved the chair close enough weeks ago that this was possible. Her hand slipped from the book's spine and settled flat against Greystone's blanketed flank. The lanterns burned at their highest setting. The frost thickened on the window. The manor above moved through its late hours, and then into its late-night depth, and the sounds descended from the busyness of evening to the minimal sounds of a building at rest, and the east wing held its particular deep silence, that was its own, and had always been its own. At 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, footsteps moved down the east wing corridor. They were not hesitant. They did not slow near the entrance, did not pause at the third storage room door, did not stop outside the elder room and wait and then retreat. They came the full length of the corridor, with the steady pace of someone who had made a decision and was honoring it. A hand pressed the door open. He came inside. He stopped 2 steps in. He had been ready for the room, had told himself he was ready, had spent 3 weeks preparing to be ready, had understood intellectually that coming here would be difficult, and had believed, in the abstract, that difficult was not the same as impossible. He had not been ready for her. The woman he had heard reading every night for 3 weeks was asleep in the corner chair, with her dark hair loose around her face, and her coat pulled around her, and her head resting against the cedar frame of his wolf's bed. Her hand was on Greystone's flank over the blankets. Her breathing was deep and even and completely unconscious. She had fallen asleep while reading. The book was still on her knee, held by a grip that habit had preserved past the point of awareness. He stood in the doorway and looked at them both. The sleeping woman and the silver wolf, the lanterns at their highest light. The frost on the window making the outside world into frosted glass. The cedar smell that he had not breathed in 2 years, and that arrived in him now, with the full force of things that were associated with something important. Not a memory exactly, but the physical residue of memory, the sensation before the image. He looked at Greystone. He had told himself, in all the weeks of preparation, that he was ready to see what the room held. He had looked at the fact of it from every angle he could manage, without directly confronting it, had held it at the careful distance of someone who understood what seeing it directly would do, and was not yet able to afford the doing. He had thought, when I go in, I will see Greystone, and I will acknowledge what I see, and I will hold it, the way I have held other things, and that will be sufficient. He looked at Greystone in the full lantern light of the elder room at 3 in the morning, and the thing he had held at distance for 19 months closed the remaining space between them, and arrived in his chest, and it was not something he could hold. The bond had snapped on the northern ridge in the middle of the engagement that had gone wrong in 3 different ways at once. The supply line that had been cut, the flanking unit that had not been where it was supposed to be, the weather that had turned in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. He had felt it in the center of his chest, a clean severing, a silence in a place that had been inhabited since he was 7 years old. There and then, not there. He had gone still for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he had gone back to the battle. He had made the decisions that needed to be made. He had held what needed holding for 18 more hours until the engagement was resolved. And then he had gone into his tent and sat on the floor for a long time, and felt the silence in his chest, and not named it. And in the morning, he had gotten up and continued the campaign. He had not named it. He looked at Greystone now, the amber eyes and the silver fur and the absolute, total, complete stillness of him, and every piece of the not naming came apart. He crossed the room without sound. He went to the far wall, opposite the cedar bed, and sat down on the cold stone floor with his back against it. He put his forearms on his knees. He looked at his wolf. He remembered a dark gray pup who had knocked a 7-year-old boy flat on their first meeting, and then licked his face before he could get up, and the boy had laughed, and Greystone had sat back and looked at him with the direct, interested attention that he would maintain for the next 37 years. That look of absolute seeing, the look that required nothing from you except that you be present and honest in front of it. He remembered sitting in the corner of his father's study the morning his father died, and Greystone had come and laid his head on his knee and simply stayed, not doing anything with the grief, not trying to address it, just being present and weighty and real, in the way that certain presences were real, and the weight had been the right thing, and he had not known how much he would need to remember what the right thing felt like until he needed it again. He remembered 24 battles and the particular quality of having Greystone at the edge of his awareness in each of them. Not guidance, not instruction, just the presence of something that knew him completely and was not afraid of what it knew, which was the form of courage you could not find anywhere, except from something that loved you. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He sat on the cold floor for a very long time. At some point in the sitting, without sound and without any change in the room that would have registered to a waking observer, his shoulders lowered from the place they had been for 19 months. He wept, not dramatically, not in the way you wept in front of others, in the quiet, complete way that you wept when you had been holding something too long and you were finally alone with it, and the holding was done. The lanterns burned, the sleeping woman breathed. The wolf lay still and silver in the amber light. Outside, the frost deepened, and the pre-dawn cold settled into the stone of the old manor, and the pine trees stood dark against a sky that was beginning, very slowly, to separate its darkness from the darker darkness that preceded dawn. He sat until his hands were steady. Then he sat longer, because the room allowed him to. He did not wake her. He considered it, briefly. She was sleeping against the cedar frame of the bed in a position that could not have been comfortable for long, and waking her would have been the more practical thing, would have cleared the room of a witness to what he needed to do inside it, would have restored the ordinary social clarity of the situation, would have been defensible as consideration for her comfort. He considered all of this from the stone floor where he sat, and then he let the consideration go. Waking her would have been for his sake, not hers. She was sleeping the deep sleep of genuine exhaustion, the kind that was doing what sleep was supposed to do, and he was not going to interrupt it. He stayed on the floor. He had been in rooms with Greystone for 37 years. He had been in this specific room twice before tonight, once when he was 19, the year of the Bond's formal establishment in the old ritual way, which had involved fire and salt and a night of sitting with Greystone, in a room very like this one, while the elders maintained the ceremony outside. And once at 31, in the year his father died, when he had come to the East Wing room because Greystone was here, and Greystone was the thing he needed, and it had been late, and the manor was full of people who needed the Alpha to be present and steady, and he had needed, for 1 hour, to not be any of those things. Greystone had received him without ceremony or condition, and he had sat on the floor of that room too, not against the wall, but beside the cedar bed, his back against the side of it, Greystone's great head resting near his shoulder, and he had been allowed, for 1 hour, to be someone who had just lost his father, rather than someone who was now in charge of everything. Greystone had always understood what was needed. That was the specific gift of a spirit wolf, the thing that distinguished them from other Bonds. They did not respond to what you presented. They responded to what you were. You could not perform anything in front of them. You could not construct a version of yourself and offer it in place of the real one. They saw through the construction immediately, and with complete gentleness, and they waited for the real one to arrive, and when it arrived, they received it, without any indication that it had taken longer than expected. He had lost that. He had lost the only presence in his life that required nothing from him except honesty, and received honesty without judgment, and he had lost it at a moment when he had not been able to let himself know about the loss, and he had carried the absence of it for 19 months while continuing to function as if the presence were still there, which was a particular kind of unsustainable discipline that he had not known was unsustainable until tonight, when he had walked into this room and seen the evidence of what he had not let himself know, and the discipline had come apart all at once. He sat on the floor and let it be apart. He looked at Greystone in the lantern light. He looked at the silver fur and the amber eyes, and the cedar bed that had been built for him, in the specific dimensions that would give him room to stretch and turn, which he had loved, the turning, the particular way a wolf settled into a resting position, by turning twice before lying down, which Greystone had done for his entire life, until he had not. He looked at the blankets the woman in the corner had laid over him, tucked with care at the edges, the particular tuck of someone who understood that care was in the details, as much as in the gesture. Someone had done that for 19 months. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about what it meant that a human healer, with no standing in the pack's formal structure, and no reason connected to her position or her duties, had come to this room every evening for 5 months, and read aloud to a wolf she had no relationship with, whom she had never met alive, whose presence in this room she had encountered entirely by accident, and had laid blankets and kept company, and spoken about birds and rivers and plants and her parents' voices, and had not once, as far as he could determine, said a word of it to anyone. He thought about what it meant that she had understood what the room held, and had come back anyway. He pressed his palm flat against the cold stone of the floor, grounding. His father had taught him that when he was very young, when you are inside something too large to think around, put your hand on something real. Stone, wood, earth, something that has been here longer than you have and will be here after. Put your hand on it, and let it remind you of the scale of things. He put his hand on the stone, and thought about scale. He was 44 years old. He had been the Alpha King of Ironcrest for 25 of those years, which meant he had been leading longer than he had been led, which meant there was a specific kind of solitude built into the position, that was not loneliness exactly, but was the solitude of authority, the particular aloneness of the person at the center of a structure, the one to whom other people oriented, and from whom other people took their bearing, which meant you could not orient yourself toward any of them without shifting the balance of the whole. He had learned to manage this solitude with efficiency, with Idris's capable partnership, with the work that always provided the next thing to be done, and with Greystone, who had been the exception, the one relationship in which the balance did not require maintaining, the one presence in which he could be what he was before the title and the position and the 25 years of accumulated decisions, the one witness to all of it who had never once needed him to be other than exactly what he was. He sat on the floor and felt the size of the absence and did not try to make it smaller. He had wept briefly in his tent on the northern ridge the morning after the bond snapped, briefly and privately, as he wept in this room tonight, though tonight the weeping was deeper and more complete, because tonight he was not marshaling himself to go back to anything. There was nothing to go back to. The campaign was over. He was home. The only thing that remained was to be in this room and let the room do what it was doing. He had been angry at himself, once, in the middle of the campaign, for the snapping of the bond. He had not let himself hold the anger long. He could not afford to be less than functional in the field, but he had felt it. The irrational conviction that if he had been more present, more attentive, less consumed with the operational demands that consumed him, the bond would not have broken. He had known, even then, that this was not how spirit bonds worked. The breaking of a bond was the wolf's passing, not the alpha's failure. The bond ended when the wolf ended, and the wolf ended when it was time. He had known this. The knowledge had not entirely reached the irrational part of him that needed someone to blame for the loss, and in the absence of a valid target it had turned on him. He had let that go, or he had stopped maintaining it, which had amounted to the same thing. There was nothing to be gained from blaming himself for a loss that had no culpable cause. Greystone had been old, and had lived a full wolf's life, and had been, in his last years, at peace, which was the most that could be wished for anything. What he had not let go was the ceremony. That was the thing he would have to carry. The 2 years and 3 months of blank page in Merritt's ledger. The 3 days of fire and gathering, and formal acknowledgement that the pack had been owed, and he had not given them. He had not given Greystone the farewell he deserved. He had not given the pack the ritual it needed. He had not given himself the grief that was required for the grief to finish. He was going to have to address that. He knew it. He had known it since the convoy came through the gate, and Idris had told him Greystone was still in the east wing, as he had been, and the look on Idris's face had contained everything he had not said. But not tonight. Tonight was for sitting on the floor in this room, and being exactly who he was, a man who had lost something irreplaceable, and had not had the courage to know it, sitting in the room where the loss lived, finally knowing it. He sat until the lanterns began to run low. He reached into his pocket and found the small oil flask he had carried for years as a habit from the field, where you always carried a small light because the dark was unforgiving. He rose quietly and refilled the lanterns closest to the cedar bed, the ones that kept Greystone's corner warm. He did this with the same care that he did all things, precise, unhurried. He stood at the cedar bed for a moment when the lanterns were full. He looked at the blankets. He looked at the book on the woman's knee, the naturalist letters he had come to know well from his place in the corridor outside. He looked at the flask she kept in the corner, and the stack of books she had finished, and the second cup in the cup holder by the table. The second cup. He had not noticed that before, or perhaps the angle had not been right. He stood at the foot of the cedar bed, and looked at Greystone for a very long time. Then he said, very quietly, so as not to wake the woman sleeping 5 feet away, "I am sorry for the time." He said it simply and plainly, the way he tried to say all things that mattered, without decoration. He stood with the words he had said for a long moment. Then he went back to the floor and sat with his back against the wall and his forearms on his knees and waited for the dawn. It came as it always came, not all at once, but as a gradual permission of light. The frost on the window began to show the suggestion of things beyond it. The stone of the room took on a color slightly different from the lantern orange it had been all night. The quality of the silence changed from night silence to morning silence, which were different in the way that the same note played on 2 different instruments were different. The same note, but not the same sound. He was still on the floor when the sleeping woman shifted slightly against the cedar frame. He watched her. She did not wake. She settled into a new angle of rest, and her breathing deepened again, and she was gone back into sleep. He looked at her hand on Greystone's flank. The blanket between her palm and the fur The easy, unconscious contact of someone who had been coming to this room long enough that resting her hand there was simply what she did, as naturally as you rested your hand on anything you had grown familiar with. He thought. 5 months. Every evening. Reading and talking and covering him with blankets and keeping the lanterns full and leaving the second cup. He thought, the pack owes you something for this. I owe you something for this. And I do not know yet how to give it, but I am going to have to figure that out. The morning light strengthened in the window. And he stayed until he was ready to move. She came back to herself in layers, the way she always came back from deep sleep. Sensation first, then location, then the light behind her closed eyes, then the specific quality of the air that told her she was not in her quarters. Cedar, cold stone underneath the warmth of her coat, the particular weight of a book balanced on her knee held by the habit of her sleeping fingers. Her neck was stiff on the left side, which told her she had been sleeping at an angle. She was in the corner chair, which meant she was in the East Wing room, which meant she had fallen asleep while reading, which was, she took a quiet breath and steadied herself. Not the most dignified situation she had ever been in, but not the most undignified either. She opened her eyes slowly. The room was in early morning light. The lanterns had been replenished at some point. They were full, burning steadily, adding their warm glow to the pale gray of the dawn coming through the window. The frost on the glass had grown during the night into a full lattice of crystals that caught the morning light and scattered it across the ceiling in slow white patterns. There was a figure on the floor. She came fully awake without moving. She had learned to do this, to arrive at complete alertness without announcing it, without the shift in breathing or the involuntary movement that would have signaled the transition. She looked at the figure from behind the stillness of apparent sleep. Kalen Voss, sitting against the far wall with his back to the stone, his forearms on his knees, looking at Greystone. He had not noticed she was awake. His face in the morning light was open in the way that faces were open when their owners believed they were alone, without the management that public faces required, without the controlled surface she had seen across the great hall at pack assemblies. He looked like someone who had recently been through something considerable, and had come out the other side of it changed. Not broken, changed. There is a difference, and she knew the difference from her work, and this was the changed kind. His eyes were red at the rims. He had been weeping. She took this in without surprise, and without any impulse to make it smaller than it was. People wept. It was a biological function with a purpose, and the dismissal of it was a social convention with no medical basis, and she had long since stopped being uncomfortable around tears in any direction. She sat up. She did it slowly and quietly, with the minimum of movement that honesty required, not pretending she had not been asleep, not performing an elaborate waking that would have been as much of a performance as continued stillness. She sat upright, stretched her neck gently from side to side with the minimal sound that made, and set the book on the floor beside the chair. He heard the movement. She watched him register it, a slight reorientation of his attention, and then his eyes moved to her and she met them. They were gray-green, which she had been unable to confirm at the distances she had seen him from before. They were steady. Whatever else was in them, and there was a great deal, she could see the depth of what had been through them in the past hours. He met her gaze without deflection, which told her something about him that matched the other things she had observed. Neither of them spoke immediately. She did not rush it. The room had taught her not to rush things, and this moment did not need to be rushed. The early morning held its particular quiet, and she let it hold. She said, eventually, quietly, without any formal weight, as if she were asking a clinical question she already partly knew the answer to. How long did you know? He did not look away from her. He said, 19 months. She heard the number land in the room. She had thought 2 years from the ledger record. 19 months was close but not 2 years. And the difference mattered, because it meant the bond had snapped in the field, on the campaign, which told her everything about why he had not named it. She said, you felt it happen. It was not quite a question. He heard the distinction and responded to it. Yes. In the field. In the middle of an engagement that had gone wrong. She said, and naming it would have... He said, naming it would have taken something from me I needed to keep intact, to continue. She nodded. She understood this. She had seen it in patience. The decision, sometimes conscious and sometimes not, to defer a truth because the timing of its arrival would have made functioning impossible. It was not denial exactly. It was more like a scheduled acknowledgement, delayed for operational reasons. The problem was that the scheduling required maintenance, and maintenance was expensive, and the schedule had a way of extending itself indefinitely, if nothing forced a reckoning. She said. And coming home was the harder part. He said. Yes. Quietly. Directly, with no attempt to soften it or contextualize it or make it more acceptable than it was. She appreciated this more than she could have explained. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me if it is not my place to ask. He looked at her with the same steadiness. He said nothing, which she read as permission to continue. She said, after you understood what had happened, after the bond, why did you choose not to come here? Not in the field, I understand that. But in the 2 months between when you must have known and when you came back. He was quiet for a long moment. She waited without filling the silence. He said, because coming here would have confirmed it. And confirmed was different from suspected, even when the suspicion was nearly certain. Confirmation requires a different kind of response than suspicion. I was not. He stopped. He started again. There were things that needed to be managed before I could afford what confirmation was going to cost. And I kept moving the threshold for when I was ready, because I was never ready. And then I came home, and the threshold moved again, and again. She said. And then a night arrived when you could not move it anymore. He said, yes. She looked at him sitting on the floor of the elder room with his back against the cold stone and his forearms on his knees, and she thought about all the ways a person could be strong, and all the specific ways that strength could work against a person, requiring so much maintenance that the maintenance became the whole of the occupation, leaving nothing for the thing that most needed attention. She said, why did you come tonight rather than one of the other nights? You came to the corridor several times. I heard you. A pause. Then, with the slight quality of someone admitting something they would not have chosen to admit but had decided to be honest about, because I heard you through the door on one of those nights. Talking about your parents. She held very still. He said, you said you could almost hear your mother's song if you tried. Some days. She had said that on an evening she had believed herself entirely alone with the room. She sat with the knowledge that it had been heard and found that she was not embarrassed by it. She was not certain why she was not embarrassed, except that the room had always been the room where things said aloud were simply said aloud, without the social weight of audience. If it had been heard in that spirit. And the person who had heard it was on the floor of the room having wept and was not using it against her. She said, what did it do? Hearing that? He said, it made it harder to keep treating the corridor as a place I could wait in indefinitely. She understood. A person could maintain a wall against a concept for a long time. It was much harder to maintain one against the specific sound of someone saying something true. She said, I want to tell you why I kept coming. After I understood what the room held. She said, because it seemed wrong to leave him alone. Not as a statement about what you had or hadn't done. Just as a fact about the room and what was in it. Something that had been important and real and loved was here. And it was alone. And I had the evenings. And I could read. And so it seemed simple. He was very still. She watched something move through his expression. Not a single emotion, but a composite one. The kind that came when several true things arrived at the same time, and the receiving had to happen for all of them at once. He said, after a moment, you knew what the room was, and you kept coming. She said, especially then. He said nothing. He looked at Greystone. She let the silence be what it needed to be. Then he said, with a quietness that was not casual, but was complete, what were you reading him? She reached down and picked up the book from the floor beside the chair. She showed him the cover. He looked at it, and something happened in his expression that was not quite a smile but lived next to one. Some recognition or response that softened the controlled surface for a moment and let something more human through. She said, I was at the end, the final letter. He was watching a family of red deer who had bedded near his camp. He said, would you read some of it? She looked at him for a moment, making sure. He met her eyes steadily. She opened the book to the last letter, found the place where her voice had slipped into sleep, and without any particular ceremony, she picked up where she had left off. She read about the red deer sleeping within 30 feet of the camp, their breath in the cold air, the female's slight awareness of the observer held without alarm. She read Henry Marsh's conclusion about what it meant to be trusted by something that had every reason not to trust. The privilege of being admitted to the ordinary life of something wild and careful. She read, "I think this may be the finest thing I have ever been given by this work. Not the data, not the reports. This." She read the final paragraph. Henry Marsh, watching the deer rise at dawn and move into the tree line. The particular quality of the morning light, the way they moved without looking back because they had no need to look back. The observer being neither threat nor center, but simply a fact of the landscape that had been tested and found reliable. She closed the book. She set it on her knee. The room was fully in morning light now. Dawn had completed its transition while she was reading. The frost on the window was beginning to diminish at the lower edges where the lantern heat reached it. He was still on the floor. He was looking at Greystone with the expression she had come to associate with him in this room. Direct, without flinching. The expression of someone who had arrived at seeing something fully and was maintaining the arrival. The breakfast bell rang through the manor above them, distant and clear, from the kitchen, the sound that meant the cooks had started the morning meal, and the building was beginning its day. Neither of them moved. She stayed with her book on her knee. He stayed against the wall. The bell's sound faded, and the room returned to its quiet. He said, after a while, "There are things I need to do. That should have been done. I need to speak to Idris. The ceremony for Greystone. There is one required. 3 days. The pack." She said, "I know what a ceremony is. I did not know the specifics. I know that it matters." He said, "It is overdue." She said, "Yes." He said it without deflection, without diminishment, with the plain honesty of someone who was going to carry the weight of it, without asking to be relieved of the weight. She respected that. There was no point in pretending to respect it less than she did. She said, "Whatever you need to do, you should do it." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Will you be here tonight?" She looked at him. She said, "Yes." He rose from the floor with the stiffness of someone who had been sitting on cold stone for hours and was not going to make much of the stiffness. He stood at the foot of the cedar bed for a long moment and looked at Greystone. She watched his face during this. The direct, unsoftened look, the acknowledgement that was not a performance for anyone else. He said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He had said what needed saying in the dark hours of the night when the room was keeping it, and the room was still keeping it. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on it, which she recognized, the same pause she made every time she left. He looked back at her once, then he left. His footsteps moved down the corridor, steady and certain, and then were gone. She stayed in the corner chair for another 30 minutes. She drank from her flask, which was cold now but was what she had. She looked at Greystone. She looked at the book on her knee. She looked at the morning light on the stone ceiling, and the diminishing frost on the window, and the 4 blankets she had stacked on Greystone the night before, tucked at every edge. She said, quietly, to the room, "Well." She stood. She gathered her things and her coat and her bag. She said good morning to Greystone in the tone she used at the end of visits. Then she walked back through the east wing corridor, into the manor, toward her room to wash her face and begin the day. She did not know yet what was coming. She only knew that the room had done something in the night that rooms built for holding things sometimes did. It had held something long enough for it to become survivable, and the person who needed that to happen had been inside it, and now the thing could be named and addressed, and all of that had happened while she was asleep against a cedar frame with a book on her knee. She went to wash her face. She had rounds in an hour. Idris knew before Kaylin said the first word. This was not a surprise. Idris was one of the most perceptive people Kaylin had known in 25 years of working closely with perceptive people, and he had been with the Alpha King through most of the significant events of the past decade, and he had lived in the same building as the fact of Greystone's situation for 2 years, and had maintained a deliberate silence about it that had cost him something every day of those 2 years. He knew. He had always known. What he had not had was permission to know it openly, and the permission was what Kaylin gave him that morning when he walked into Idris's office at 7:30 and closed the door and said, "I went to the East Wing last night." Idris set down his pen. He looked at Kaylin for a moment with the specific expression he used when he was organizing multiple simultaneous responses and deciding which one to give first. Then he said, "I am glad." 2 words. Kaylin had expected more, or something more difficult. And the two words were both simpler and more precise than what he had expected. He sat down across from Idris's desk and said, "The bond has been gone for 19 months. Idris said, "I know." He said, "I should have told you." Idris said, "Yes," and then, with the particular honesty that made him the right person for the role he held, "And I should have pressed you on it, and I chose not to, and that was also not right." Kalen looked at his beta. He said, "I will not make what I failed to do your fault." Idris said, "And I will not let you carry all of it when I could have done more and did not." They sat with that for a moment, two men who were honest with each other in the way that required practice and trust in roughly equal measure. Kalen said, "The ceremony needs to be planned. 3 days. The full pack. I want it done before the deep cold makes the clearing unusable." Idris picked up his pen. He said, 10 days? Kalen said, 10 days is good. Idris wrote something in his margin. Then he said, without looking up, "The pack will have questions." Kalen said, "The pack deserves questions. Let them have them." The inner circle meeting was called for that afternoon. The 8 people who constituted the pack's formal governing structure, the Alpha and Beta, 3 elders, and 3 senior warriors, which included Owen. Kalen had worked with Owen for 11 years. Owen was direct in the way that wolves who had been in difficult situations were direct, efficient with his words, and not interested in cushioning the ones that needed to land hard. Kalen valued this quality in almost all circumstances, and was prepared to receive it in this one. The meeting was held in the formal council room, the long table with the old chairs, the windows looking out at the north courtyard where the first real snow had started to fall sometime that morning. A light and steady fall that was doing the thing it had been promising for days, and covering everything in the particular equal white of first proper snow. Kalen sat at the head of the table and did not call it to order formally, because the situation did not call for formality. He said, "You know why I called this meeting?" He said, "I am going to tell you the truth of the situation, and I am asking you to receive it as your alpha telling you something that needed to be told sooner, and was not." He said, "Greystone is gone. The bond ended 19 months ago. I did not name it publicly. I did not begin the ceremony process. I made choices that put my own functional continuation above the pack's right to know, and above what was owed to Greystone. I am telling you now because it is the only right thing to do." He stopped and let the room receive this. Elder Bram was the first to speak, and he spoke carefully, with the measured weight of someone who was holding a large reaction at deliberate distance in order to be useful. He said, "The ceremony is a significant matter, not only for Greystone's passing, but for the bond history. The pack carries the bond's history through ceremony. Without it, that history has been," Kalen said, "unacknowledged. For 19 months. Elder Bram was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." Owen said, "With respect, that is not a small thing." Kalen said, "No, it is not." Owen looked at him. This was the part Kalen had anticipated. Not with dread exactly, but with the plain awareness that Owen's frustration was valid, and he was not going to manage it away, or redirect it, or soften it with explanation. He was going to let it land, because it needed to land. Owen said, "The pack was not told. The pack was not given the ceremony. The pack was given the situation, as if it were continuing, which it was not, and we organized our understanding of the leadership around a part of that leadership that no longer existed. That is not." He stopped himself. He breathed out slowly. He looked at the table. Then he said, "I understand there were circumstances. I am not without understanding of what those circumstances cost you. But I need you to understand what it cost us." Kalen said, "I understand. And I am telling you now so that the cost can be acknowledged and the ceremony can begin to address it." Owen said nothing more. He looked at the table for a moment longer, and then he looked back up, and his expression had moved from the edge of open anger to the more controlled terrain of someone who has said the true thing and can wait to see what is done with it. Elder Petra said, quietly and with great precision, "There is something else the circle should know." Everyone looked at her. She said, "In the 5 months before this evening, Greystone has been visited every evening by the human healer Nora Ashfield, who has sat with him and read to him, and maintained the room's lanterns, and kept him covered. She did this without being asked to do it, and without telling anyone she was doing it. I became aware of the visits 6 weeks ago, and I chose to allow them to continue. That decision was mine. The room received this information with the particular quality of a group of people adjusting their picture of a situation. Kaelin said, "I want the circle to understand this clearly. A human healer with no formal standing gave Greystone what the pack and I failed to give him: presence, company, care, consistency, for 5 months. That is not peripheral information. That is information that belongs at the center of how the pack thinks about the ceremony and about what comes after it." Owen said, "She is the healer. She has been here 18 years. Kaelin said, "Yes." Owen was quiet. Something in his expression was moving, recalibrating, though he did not say anything more about it at the meeting. Elder Bram and Elder Petra took the ceremony planning in hand, with the organized efficiency of people who had prepared ceremonies before and knew exactly what 3 days of fire and gathering required. The clearing would need clearing from the new snow. The ceremony fire materials needed to be assembled. The formal invocations needed to be prepared. Elder Bram was the keeper of the pack's oral history, and the ceremony invocations were part of it. Notifications needed to go to every pack member through the standard channels. 3 days, beginning at sundown 10 days from today. The meeting closed without fanfare. The circle left in the various states that news of this size left people in. Owen, quietly, with his jaw set and his eyes directed somewhere middle distance. Idris, with the additional weight of tasks that needed to be managed carefully and quickly. Elder Petra, with her characteristic unreadable composure, the expression of someone who had processed what she needed to process before the meeting began, rather than during it. Kaelin stayed in the council room for a while after they left. He thought about Nora Ashfield. He thought about her face in the morning light of the elder room, coming awake with that specific controlled transition, meeting his eyes without deflection or apology or performance. He thought about her saying, "I want to tell you why I kept coming," as if the reason were something he was owed, as if the transparency were simply what the situation called for. He thought about what she had said, because it seemed wrong to leave him alone, and the complete absence of any expectation of acknowledgement in the saying of it. She had not said it to produce an effect. She had said it because it was true, and the room was a room where true things were said. He was going to have to think about what was owed to her, not just what he owed, but what the pack owed. The pack keeper title existed. He had been aware of it for 25 years, a part of the pack's formal history that had been essentially ceremonial for 3 generations, a recognition that had last been given to a man who had preserved the pack's records through a period of severe disruption. He had thought of it as a historical relic. He thought about it now differently. He would discuss it with Elder Petra. She would know what the title required. Through all of this planning and meeting and deciding, Nora continued her rounds. She treated a respiratory infection in the North Residential Quarter. She finished the anti-inflammatory batch and distributed it to the appropriate shelf. She sat with Cole during his follow-up and confirmed that his ribs were progressing well, and that if he continued as he was going, he would be fully clear for training by the end of the week. He received this with a combination of relief and something that looked like it wanted to be gratitude, but had not quite made it through the social distance he maintained by default. She heard things in the manner she always heard things, at the edges, through the behavior of people around her, rather than through any direct communication. Something significant was happening in the senior levels of the pack. The meetings were more frequent. The atmosphere in the corridors had a quality of particular attention that was different from the post-return settling she had been observing. People were talking quietly in the ways that people talked when something was being processed collectively, but not yet openly. Lena came to her on the 3rd afternoon. She came with 2 cups of tea again, which was Lena's way of signaling a conversation that required sitting down. She sat on her stool, and Nora stood at the preparation table, and Lena said, carefully and precisely, "The ceremony for Greystone is being planned. It begins in 7 days." Nora was quiet for a moment. She set down what she was holding. She said, "I heard something was happening. I did not know what specifically." Lena said, "Elder Bram and Elder Petra are organizing it. 3 days at the North Clearing. Full pack gathering." She paused. "It is overdue by the pack's understanding, and the meetings, I am told, have been significant." Nora said, "Yes, I imagine they have been." Lena looked at her over the rim of her cup. She said, with the specific careful quality that meant she was saying something she had considered very precisely before saying, "I know you have been going to the East Wing. I have known for months. I also know that what you have been doing there is not nothing." Nora said, "No, it is not nothing." Lena said, "Whatever happens in the next few weeks, I want you to know that I have known, and I have been. She stopped. She said, I am proud of you. That is the word. Nora looked at Lena's face across the preparation table, the solid, pragmatic, competent face that had been her professional anchor for 12 years, and found herself needing a moment before she could answer. She said, Thank you. Lena drank her tea. The preparation room held its smell of pine resin and lavender and whatever the other thing was that she had never entirely identified, and outside the window the snow was still falling in its light and steady way, and something in the quality of the afternoon felt like a held breath. That evening, Nora went to the East Wing. She sat in her corner chair and opened the Mountain Bird Guide to a new chapter, because Henry Marsh was finished now, and she had taken the bird guide from her bag instead. She read about the red grouse, which was a bird of remarkable stubbornness, and lived in places that most sensible creatures had concluded were not worth living in, and which had organized its entire existence around a single narrow resource and had made it work. She found the red grouse admirable. She talked for a while between chapters. She told Greystone that the ceremony was being planned. She said it was going to happen, and that was right, and that she was glad. She said, before she left that night, whatever comes next, I want you to know that these evenings were complete in themselves. I did not need them to be more than they were, and I do not need what comes next to be anything in particular. They were enough. Just this room and your company, and the books I got to read and all the things I got to say in here that I had never said anywhere else, that was enough. That is more than enough. She adjusted the blankets. She turned down one lantern, left one burning. She said goodnight. She let herself out into the East Wing corridor and walked back to her quarters in the cold of the night, and went to bed and slept without difficulty, which was its own kind of answer to whatever question had been in her chest, and which told her more about where she stood than anything she could have said in words. The ceremony fire was built on the afternoon of the first day in the clearing north of the manor, where the pine trees opened in a wide ring around a space of ground that had been kept clear by use and intention for longer than anyone in the current pack could personally remember. Nora had heard the clearing mentioned over the years the way she had heard many of the pack's structural elements mentioned, in passing, in the background, not directed at her but audible to anyone who lived in the same building and paid attention. The clearing was for fire gatherings. The pack used it for ceremonies of passing, of significant transition, of formal acknowledgement. She had never been to it. She went to the tree line on the first evening and stood among the pines. She had not been told to come. She had not been told not to come. There had been no formal notification of any kind directed at her about the ceremony. She was not a pack member in the structural sense. She had no defined role. She was the healer, and the healer's role was in the healing rooms. The ceremony invitations had gone through the pack's normal channels, and she had not been on those channels. She had come anyway, because not coming had, by the first evening, become a thing she could not manage. She stood between two pines at the edge of the clearing and watched the fire being built. It was a significant construction, 7 feet high at its center, a careful architecture of pine and oak that the 2 younger warriors assigned to building it had worked on for most of the afternoon, following instructions that Elder Bram provided with the precision of someone who had built ceremony fires before and knew the difference between a fire built correctly and one that simply burned. There was a structure inside the wood, a configuration of layering that affected how the fire burned, and how long, and with what quality of light and heat. She watched the building of it with the attention she brought to things she wanted to understand. It went up in a way that caught her off guard despite herself, a rush of flame that was faster and taller than she had expected, the architecture inside the wood becoming suddenly visible in the way the fire moved through it, not randomly but following the design, the heat rising in a column that made the cold air above it shimmer. The pack had assembled by this point in a full ring around the clearing, 3 to 4 people deep, and the fire's lighting produced from that ring a collective sound that was not a cheer and not a word, but something between them, something with a frequency she felt in her chest rather than heard with her ears. She stayed at the tree line. She was aware that she was on the outside of the ring, which was her usual position, and she held it without drama. Idris spoke first. He spoke about the bond between an alpha and a spirit wolf, in terms that were historical and formal, giving the ceremony its proper framework, the context that made the 3 days not just a gathering, but a specific kind of accounting. He spoke about what bonds were in the pack's understanding, not simply connections between individual animals and individual people, but threads in the larger fabric of the pack's continuity. When a bond ended, the pack felt it even if they did not know it consciously. The ceremony was the conscious knowing. Elder Bram spoke next, longer, his voice carrying across the clearing with the effortless volume of someone who had been using it in large spaces for decades. He spoke about Greystone specifically, the history of the wolf from his bonding year, the campaigns he had been part of, the years of quiet residence in the East Wing that had followed the end of his active years. He spoke about these things with the care of the pack's oral historian, which was what he was, holding the detail and the accuracy that official memory required. He spoke about the bond's history as a part of the pack's history, which it was, and his voice gave it the weight that history carried when someone told it who understood what history was for. Then Kalen spoke. His voice across the clearing was different from his voice in the manor's formal spaces. The clearing was open and cold, and the fire was loud, and the wind moved through the pines at the edge, and his voice had to carry over all of this, without being performative, without being pushed past its natural register into something that had the size of the space, but not the honesty. He managed it. He found the volume that the clearing needed, without losing the quality that made his voice his, and what came through was both large enough to reach everyone in the ring, and honest enough to reach anyone who was listening. He spoke about a 7-year-old boy. He said it plainly, without self-consciousness, which was the only way to speak about 7-year-old selves in public with any dignity. He said the pup had been dark gray, not silver yet, and had knocked him flat in the first 30 seconds of their meeting, and then sat back and looked at him, with an expression that was, he said, the most direct and unimpressed look he had ever received from any living thing, and he had been receiving unimpressed looks from various directions ever since. And from that first meeting on, Greystone had never looked at him with anything less than complete and honest attention. He spoke about the bond across the years, the training years, the difficult years of his father's illness and death, the early years of his alpha tenure, when he had been younger than the situation had required, and Greystone had been the only witness to the daily reality of that gap. He spoke about battles and about the particular quality of having a presence at the edge of your awareness that was yours completely, that knew you without condition, that asked only that you be honest in front of it. He spoke about the day the bond ended. He said it briefly, and with no attempt to make it less than what it was. On a ridge above the northern tree line, in the middle of an engagement that had gone wrong, he had felt the bond end. He had gone back to the battle, because going back to the battle was what the situation required. He had not named the loss until he came home, and coming home had been the harder part. He said, I owe the pack the ceremony it should have received 19 months ago. This ceremony is the beginning of that debt's repayment. It is not the whole of the repayment, and I am not asking for the debt to be forgiven. I am asking for the ceremony to do what ceremonies do, hold what needs holding, in front of the people who were owed the holding. The fire was at its height. The sparks rose in a column above the clearing and joined the cold sky, and the pack stood in its ring, and the pine trees stood at the ring's edge, and the night held all of it in its wide, cold dark. He stopped speaking for a moment. She watched from the tree line. She watched his face in the firelight, which was the first time she had seen him in this kind of light, and which showed him differently than any of the manor's interior lighting had, starker, more alive in some way, the planes of his face sharper, and the fatigue that was always present, reduced by the particular quality of fire and cold, into something that was simply the mark of a person who had been through things, rather than the burden of someone who was still in them. He looked out over the assembled pack. He said, there is something else this ceremony needs to acknowledge, something the pack should know. He said Nora's name. She heard her own name across the clearing in his voice, and it landed in her chest, with the specific force of complete unexpectedness, the force of a thing you had not prepared for, because you had not known to prepare. He said, Nora Ashfield gave Greystone what the pack and I failed to give him. For 5 months she came every evening to the elder room. She read to him. She sat with him. She kept his room lit and his blankets arranged, and she kept him company through every evening of those months, with no reason connected to her duties, no expectation of acknowledgement, and no audience. She did it because she believed it was right. In this pack we speak often about the bonds that run deep between wolves. Tonight, I want to name a bond that ran alongside those bonds, quietly and without announcement, for 5 months. The bond between a human woman and an animal she had never known alive, who needed company that she was capable of giving, and who received it every evening without fail. He said, "Nora Ashfield, will you come forward?" She was at the tree line. She had not moved yet. She was very still, with her hands at her sides, and the sound of her name in that sentence, in that voice, doing something in her chest that she did not have immediate words for. She was aware that every person in the ring had turned, following the direction of Kaylin's gaze, and that the fire lit their faces as they turned, and that the ring was now a ring that was looking toward the tree line where she stood. The snow was thin and even under her boots, and caught the firelight in small scattered reflections as she moved across the clearing toward the inner ring. She had no awareness of how she looked, no self-conscious calculation of what she was doing or how she was doing it. She only knew the snow under her feet and the fire's heat increasing as she came nearer, and the faces turning to watch her pass, and among those faces, Owen, who was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face, directed at her before, something that was not warmth exactly. Owen not being a person who moved quickly to warmth, but was the particular open quality that came when a person was reassessing something that had been in a fixed position for a long time. She reached the inner ring. The pack closed behind her. She stood in the center, 6 feet from Kaylin, the fire to her left throwing warmth across the right side of her face and neck. He looked at her. His eyes in the firelight were the gray-green she had confirmed in the morning room, and they were steady as they had been in the morning room, and they were in this moment also grateful in a way that was not a performance but was simply present. He said, in his full voice, clearly, and without any attempt to soften it into something smaller than it was, "The Iron Crest pack has something very old, older than the manor, older than the current arrangement of its structure. The title of Pack Keeper, it was last given 3 generations ago, to a man who preserved the pack's history through a period of disruption, when that preservation was the most important thing that could be done. The title is not a rank in the formal structure. It is a recognition of a different kind of faithfulness, the faithfulness that maintains things that would otherwise be lost, that keeps company with things that need keeping company with, that stays when staying is the right thing, and does not require instruction or observation to know that it is right." He paused. "Tonight we give it to Nora Ashfield." Elder Petra came forward from the inner ring. She was carrying something in both hands, held with the deliberateness of someone handling something whose significance she understood completely. It was a token of cedar wood, flat and smooth at its surface, worn at its edges with long handling, the wood a deep, warm color, polished by time and the oil of many hands. She held it toward Nora. Nora took it with both hands, the way the moment asked her to take it, with both hands, because it required both hands, because it was that kind of thing. It was lighter than she had expected, and heavier than its weight, which was the quality of objects that carried their history with them. It was warm from Elder Petra's hands. It smelled of cedar. Elder Petra said, "Pack Keeper." She said it simply, 2 words, but in Elder Petra's voice, which had the precision of someone who did not use words carelessly. The 2 words were the whole of what needed to be said. The sound started at the far side of the ring. A single voice, one of the elder wolves, deep and resonant, the sound that was the pack's formal acknowledgement, not a cheer, not words, but the specific harmonic sound that a pack made when it was collectively honoring something. It spread from that first voice outward and inward simultaneously, the ring filling with the sound, voice by voice, until it surrounded her completely. She stood in the center of it with the cedar token in both hands, and the fire at her side, and the cold night above her full of stars that had appeared while the ceremony had been happening. The cloud cover, that had persisted for days, finally breaking open to show the winter sky in its full depth. She did not cry. She had made herself a promise about this on the walk from the tree line, a small private promise that she was going to be present for the whole of this moment, rather than overwhelmed by it, because a moment this large deserved full presence rather than tears. She held to it with everything she had, which was considerable, which was in fact all of what she had, and she stood in the firelight with the cedar token and the encircling sound, and let the moment be what it was. The fire reached its highest point. The sparks went up into the cold, clear sky, and the winter stars received them, and the pack's sound held the clearing full, and the pine trees stood at the edges of it all, dark and very still, the way pines stood in the cold when there was no wind, absolutely present, without apology, having been here far longer than anything being witnessed under them, and likely to be here long after. She stood in the center of it and breathed, and did not cry. She came very close, but she did not. The book appeared on a Monday morning. She nearly stepped on it coming out of the supply room. It was placed on the threshold of the healing room doorway, with the deliberateness of something that had been set down carefully, rather than left in passing. Spine aligned with the edge of the frame, cover face up, positioned so that anyone walking out of the supply room would see it, and anyone walking into the healing room from the corridor would step around it, which was the positioning of something intended to be found, rather than encountered accidentally. It was a field guide to mountain birds, not the one she had been reading, a different edition, older, with more detail in the illustration section, and additional chapters covering species she had not read about in the version she had borrowed from the library. She stood in the doorway and held it for a moment. No note inside the cover, no inscription, just the book, placed with intention, from a direction she could not prove but understood. She brought it inside and set it on the corner of the preparation table, and went back to her rounds. On Wednesday there was a second book on the threshold, the collected letters of a naturalist who had spent 20 years in the southern marshlands, which was a habitat so different from the mountains and the East Wing cedar room, that the choice of it made her pause for a moment, holding the book and thinking about what it meant to be given a book that said, "Here is somewhere else entirely to go." She read the first 3 chapters that same evening in the East Wing, and found the marshland naturalist to be excellent company. She left a book in return. She had been thinking about which one since the second Monday morning, and she chose carefully. The collected essays of a natural historian who wrote about the whole of the observed world rather than a single habitat or species, whose range was as wide as his attention was deep, and whose best essay, the 4th one in the collection, on the way forests communicated through their root systems in ways that looked to a surface observer like individual trees, but were in fact a single interconnected conversation, she had read twice and intended to read again. She placed it on the threshold of the study at the end of the main corridor at 6 in the morning, before anyone else was moving in that part of the building. She went to her rounds. The pack had shifted toward her in the days after the ceremony, in the way that things shifted when the ground had been publicly changed, and everyone was adjusting their footing. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden warmth that reversed the long years of polite distance. It was smaller and more real than that, the specific, incremental changes that happened when people were reassessing something in their picture of the world, and the reassessment was working its way through their behavior without being announced. Owen nodded at her in the corridor now with the quality of someone who was paying attention to her rather than processing her. It was a small change, but it was real, and she had enough experience of Owen's habitual acknowledgement to know the difference between the two. Cole had not stopped appearing in the healing room corridor with reasons she sometimes found medically plausible, and sometimes found creative, and he called her Nora, reliably now, and with the ease of someone for whom this had become simply true. A young female warrior named Bryn, who had been treated for a shoulder injury the previous month and had barely spoken during the treatment, appeared in the healing room one afternoon to return a cup she had borrowed from the supply room at some earlier point, and stayed to talk about nothing in particular for 15 minutes, which was 15 minutes more than Bryn had ever previously offered. These were small things. Nora was good at small things. Lena, who had been the largest constant in Nora's professional life for 12 years, and who had never needed things to be dramatic in order to understand them, received the changes in the pack's behavior toward Nora with a private satisfaction that she expressed primarily through a slight increase in the quality of the tea she provided on their morning breaks. Not better tea, which was not possible because Lena always bought the good tea, but tea provided with a slightly more deliberate quality of intention, which was Lena's way of celebrating things without making them into occasions. Idris found her in the main corridor 2 weeks after the ceremony, and said, briefly and with his usual efficiency, that the Alpha King had asked whether the Alpine Plant Guide from the East Wing room was available for borrowing. She said she had left it in the room for anyone's use. Idris said he would pass that along. He nodded in the way he nodded to people whose position in his picture of the pack he was accounting for carefully, which was a different quality of nod from his administrative nod, and he walked on. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he left. Then she continued to her rounds. The cedar token was on her bedside table. She had held it every night since the ceremony, the last thing she did before turning out the light. It had the particular tactile quality of something made by good hands in good wood and then worn by time into a smoothness that was different from polished smoothness, warmer, more irregular at the micro level, the kind of smoothness that said, "Many hands have held this." She did not know all the hands. She knew Elder Petra's hands and now her own, and the ones before, going back 3 generations to the man who had last held the title, and whatever hands had held it in the years between. She thought about those hands sometimes. She thought about what they had kept. She started keeping the candle in the East Wing room's window. It was a small candle, the kind she had in her quarters for the evenings, when she preferred candlelight to the sharper lantern light for reading. She brought one to the East Wing one evening without making it a decision, lit it in the window when she arrived, and found that the gesture had a quality she had not anticipated, the feeling of announcing, quietly, to the darkness outside the window, and to anyone who might see the window from the courtyard or the pines. This room is occupied, this is not a forgotten place. She blew the candle out when she left, and brought a new one the next evening. She had done it every evening since. On a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the ceremony, she was in the East Wing, reading the Mountain Bird Guide, when the door opened. She was in the middle of the Choff chapter again. The new guide's version of it was more detailed than the old one, with a longer section on the cultural transmission research, and she was reading aloud about the box latch technique being passed from parents to offspring over multiple generations, when the familiar sound of the door's frame releasing told her the door was opening. She did not stop reading. She read the end of the paragraph, set the page with her thumb as a placeholder, and looked up. He came in with the ease of someone who had come into a room before, and found it to be what he had hoped it would be. He was in the plain dark jacket she had come to associate with his off-duty hours in the building, not the formal gear of the Alpha in residence, but the clothes of a person at the end of a long day who had stopped carrying the title long enough to be themselves. He looked at the room the way he did when he first entered it, that brief survey, letting it be what it was. He looked at Greystone. He looked at the candle in the window. He looked at her. He said, "The Choffs again?" She said, "A better version of the same chapter. This guide has the cultural transmission research in more detail." He said, "Is it the box latch technique?" She said, "You know about that?" He said, "The natural history essay collection you left mentioned it briefly. I went back to look for more on it." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "And did you find more?" He said, "I found this guide on the library shelf. I think you may have shelved it incorrectly by about 6 inches in the direction of where I was looking." She said, "That was entirely accidental." He looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile, but lived next to one, and had been appearing with more frequency in the weeks since the ceremony, and she had begun to understand it as the way his face moved when he found something genuinely rather than socially amusing. He crossed to the far wall and sat down in his spot. He moved to it without deliberation, the way you move to a place that had become yours through use rather than assignment. His back against the wall, knees loosely bent, the posture she had come to associate with him in this room specifically, not the controlled bearing of the Alpha in the corridor, but the ease of someone who had found a place where the control could be set down. She said, "I want to ask you something about the forest essay." "The one about root communication," he said, "the 4th one." She said, "Did you read the part about the way the oldest trees functioned as nodes in the network, the ones that had the widest root systems and connected to the most other trees?" He said, "The hub trees." She said, "Yes. Do you think—" And then she stopped herself, because she had been about to say something about how she thought packs were organized in a similar way, with the oldest bonds serving as the connective tissue through which everything else communicated, and the spirit-wolf bond being the deepest root of the whole system, and she was not certain whether this was an observation he wanted to receive in this room, which was Greystone's room, which was where the deepest root had been, and was now only its memory. He said, "Say it." She looked at him. He said, "I can see you stopping yourself. Say what you were going to say." She said it. She said the thing about hub trees and pack structure, and the spirit-wolf bond as the deepest root, saying it plainly and without softening it, because he had asked her to say it, and because the room was the room where she said things plainly. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. He looked at Greystone, and his expression during the looking was the direct, steady expression she had seen on him in this room before, present with the loss without being overwhelmed by it, which was different from either the avoidance that had preceded the morning in this room, or the raw weight of that morning itself. It was something beyond both of those. It was what grief looked like when it had been fully carried for long enough to become something you moved with, rather than something you moved around. He said, "I think you are right." And I think the pack has been feeling the absence of that root for 2 years, without knowing what was missing. The ceremony will have helped with some of that. But you cannot restore a hub tree. You can only let the forest reorganize around the space where it was. She said, and maybe that reorganization is its own kind of strength. He said, maybe. They were quiet for a while. She opened the bird guide and read 2 more pages of the Choff chapter, and he listened from the floor, and the candle in the window burned its slow burn. The snow outside had been falling all day, not the light snow of the past weeks, but a real snowfall, the kind that committed, and the pine trees beyond the window had become shapes, defined by white rather than by bark and needle. The clearing to the north was invisible under it. The world outside the manor had simplified itself into white and dark and the slow fall of more white. She read the final pages of the Choff chapter and closed the book. She said, I will start the ptarmigan next, the one that turns white in winter. He said, the one that changes color to match the season. She said, yes. I find it extraordinary that it works, that something can change so completely and remain itself. He looked at the candle in the window. He said, it works because the thing that changes is not the essential part. She looked at him. He was looking at the candle, and the candle's light was on his face, and his face had the quality it had in this room, open, without the managed surface, simply what it was. She thought about all the things that had changed in the months since she had first stepped into this room by accident, with a lantern raised, and a question about elderflower, and about the things that had remained unchanged through all of it. The cedar smell, the amber eyes, the blankets laid with care at the edges, the voice that found its truest register in a room that asked nothing of it. She thought about hub trees and the ways forests reorganized around losses they could not restore, and about how the reorganization was real, which was not the same as the original arrangement but was its own form of continuity. She did not say any of this. She set the bird guide on the chair arm. She looked at the candle. The snow fell outside the window, quietly and without urgency, the way it fell when it had all night, and meant it. He was still on the floor. She was still in the chair. She said, I am going to read the first page of the ptarmigan chapter. He said, all right. She opened the guide. She found the ptarmigan. She said, the white-tailed ptarmigan is found at higher elevations than almost any other bird in its range. It has no fear of altitude and considerable tolerance for cold, which the naturalist writing this section suggests is not a tolerance it developed but a preference it was born with, as if, from the beginning, it was made for the high places where most other things did not go. She read the first page in her room voice, the steady and unhurried voice that this room had been drawing out of her for 6 months now, and that she had stopped being surprised by. She read about the ptarmigan's habits, its preference for the tundra slopes above the tree line, its community structure, the way it spent winters in flocks of 200 or 300, and then dispersed in spring, into something much more individual. She was halfway through the second page, when she paused to turn it, and glanced up, and found that he was looking at her, rather than at Greystone. Not for long. He moved his gaze back to the middle distance almost immediately, with the slight self-consciousness of someone who had been noticing. She looked back down at her page. She turned it. She kept reading. The candle burned in the window. The snow fell beyond the frosted glass. The lanterns were at their warm setting, and the cedar smell was what it always was, and Greystone lay on his cedar bed in the silver stillness that was the only form he had now, which was a form that the room had learned to hold, and which the room held without judgment, and without requiring it to be anything other than exactly what it was. She read until she reached the end of the section. She closed the book and set it on the chair arm. She looked at the candle. She said, same time tomorrow. He said, same time tomorrow. She stood. She gathered her things. She tucked the blankets at Greystone's edges the way she always did, the specific tuck she had developed over 6 months of daily practice, the tuck of someone who knew this particular blanket and this particular frame, and had learned exactly where the edge needed to go. She adjusted the lanterns. She picked up the candle from the window, still lit, and held it. She looked at Kalen on the floor. He was looking at Greystone with the direct, steady expression. He would stay for a while after she left, she knew. She had come to understand this without being told, that he arrived after her some evenings and stayed after her most of them, that the room had become in the past weeks a room that held both of them at different times, and sometimes at the same time, and that this had happened without announcement and without negotiation, and was simply what had occurred. The way things that were right occurred, when the conditions were right, and neither person was working against them. She said good night. He said good night. She let herself out of the door. She walked the east wing corridor with the candle in her hand, the small flame very steady in the still corridor air. At the entrance she stopped, the way she always stopped. She turned back. She looked down the corridor to the elder room's closed door, the faint glow of the lanterns she had left on, showing through the gap at the bottom. The room was lit. The room was not empty. The room was what it had always been, a room that held things. She turned and walked back into the manor, through its corridors, past the common rooms where the pack was in its evening, past the staircase and the north corridor, and the kitchen sounds, and the voices, and all the sounds of a place that was alive, and occupied, and full of bonds that ran in all their complicated directions. She walked through it with the candle in her hand, and the cedar token in her pocket, and the mountain bird guide under her arm, and she went to her quarters, and set the candle on her bedside table, and sat for a while on the edge of her bed. She did not think about what any of it meant in terms of what came next. She had learned, in this room and through the work of 6 months, that the meaning of a thing did not need to be grasped at the moment of its occurring. The moment was complete in itself. The next moment would be what it was going to be. The room had taught her this, the room that had held grief, and held her, and held the quiet, faithful act of returning every evening, and that had held all of those things simultaneously, and made room for more. She lay down. The cedar token was warm in her hand. Outside the window the snow was still falling, the serious snowfall that had committed to the night, and the pine trees beyond the courtyard were white-shouldered shapes in the dark, and the east wing at the far end of the manor held its light in the window the way she had left it, small and steady, visible from outside, saying, "Something is here. Something has not been forgotten." She went to sleep. Tomorrow she would read about the ptarmigan. Tomorrow he would come in from the corridor and sit down on the cold floor and listen with his forearms on his knees and his back against the stone. Tomorrow the candle would burn in the window, and the lanterns would be warm, and the cedar smell would be what it always was. Tomorrow Greystone would lie on his cedar bed in his silver stillness, present in the way that things were present when they had been loved and remembered, and given the company they deserved. Tomorrow the room would hold what the room held. It always had. It always would. That was the nature of rooms built to hold things, rooms that had learned over long use what it meant to receive without judgment, and keep without asking to be thanked for the keeping. She closed her eyes. She slept. The snow fell outside and the candle burned at the east wing window, and the winter settled over the Iron Crest territory with its full and equable weight, and underneath it, everything that had been kept was still being kept, and everything that had been found was still being held, and the room at the end of the east wing corridor had the light on, the way it would from now on, small and steady in the dark, because someone had decided that a room like that deserved to be seen.